Hey guys, tonight we begin with something more ridiculous than your family's holiday dinner arguments. The bizarre, completely unhinged food rules that actual royals had to follow. We're not talking about which fork to use or keeping your elbows off the table. We're talking about rules so absurd, so painfully specific, that you'd think someone was pranking the entire aristocracy. Spoiler, they weren't. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to eat dinner as royalty? Did they actually enjoy their food? Or was every meal a performance where one wrong move could get you beheaded? Could you survive a single banquet without insulting someone's ancestry by using the wrong spoon? What happened if you accidentally ate before the king did? Was there really a guy whose entire job was to taste the food first, to make sure it wasn't poisoned? And why on earth were some foods considered too common for royal lips while others, equally disgusting, were celebrated as delicacies? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up as a low-ranking noble at a European royal court. The year is 1650. You're wearing approximately 40 pounds of velvet, your stomach is growling, and you're about to discover that eating lunch is somehow more complicated than filing your taxes. Good luck. Before we even get to the weird rules about eating, let's talk about the poor soul whose entire existence revolved around not dying at breakfast. The royal food taster wasn't some glamorous position with a fancy title and a corner office. This was a person, usually someone expendable, like a lower servant or a minor courtier who'd annoyed the wrong person, whose job was to eat a bit of everything before it reached the king's lips. Why? Because poison was basically the medieval version of a hostile takeover. You're standing in the royal kitchens. It's dawn. The air smells like roasting meat, fresh bread, and the faint metallic tang of fear. You're the taster. Your job description is simple. Eat first, hope you don't die. Every single dish that goes to the king's table has to pass through your digestive system first. The roasted pheasant, you get a bite. The wine, you get a sip. The delicate pastries stuffed with almonds and honey, you taste those too, and you'd better pray none of them contain ground-up apricot kernels, which, by the way, contain cyanide. This wasn't paranoia. Poisoning was a legitimate Chang, used method of political assassination. Rival nobles, angry spouses, ambitious heirs, they all had access to the kitchens and a working knowledge of toxic herbs. Arsenic, hemlock, nightshade, mercury. These weren't just ingredients in folklore. They were tools of the trade, and they worked quietly. A pinch in the soup, a sprinkle in the sauce, and within hours the king would be clutching his stomach and making his peace with God. So you, the taster, became the royal canary in the coal mine, except canaries don't have to pretend they're enjoying it. Here's what your morning looks like. You arrive in the kitchens before anyone else. The cooks are already sweating over open fires, stirring pots, basting meats, shouting at undercooks who've burnt the bread. You stand off to the side, hands clasped, stomach growling, trying not to think about the fact that you're about to eat a meal that might kill you. A servant brings over a tray. On it, a small portion of everything destined for the king's breakfast. A sliver of ham, a corner of bread, a spoonful of porridge, a thimble of wine. You eat, and then you wait. This is the worst part. Not the eating, that's almost pleasant, especially if the food is good. No, the worst part is the 20 to 30 minutes immediately after, when you're standing there, sweating, wondering if your tongue is tingling because of the spices, or because you've just ingested enough belladonna to stop your heart. Every twitch, every stomach gurgle, every slight headache becomes a potential death sentence. If you start feeling dizzy, someone notices. If you vomit, bells start ringing. If you collapse, the entire meal is thrown out. The kitchen staff is interrogated, and someone, possibly you if you survive, is getting blamed. But if you're fine, if 30 minutes pass and you're still standing, still breathing, still not foaming at the mouth, congratulations. The king's breakfast is served. You get to do it all over again at lunch. Now you might think, well, at least the food is good, right? At least you're eating like royalty. Wrong. You're eating like a lab rat. The portions you receive are tiny, just enough to detect poison, not enough to enjoy. You don't get to savour anything. You're not dining. You're performing a medical test with your internal organs. And let's talk about the psychological toll. You're essentially playing Russian roulette 3 times a day. You go to bed every night knowing that tomorrow morning you'll wake up and do it again. Taste the eggs, taste the meat, taste the wine. Hope none of it kills you. There's no hazard pay, no retirement plan, no workers' compensation if you accidentally ingest mercury and spend the next 3 days hallucinating. Some tasters were volunteers, loyal servants who genuinely wanted to protect their monarch. Others were conscripted, forced into the role because they had no other options or because they'd fallen out of favour, and this was their punishment. Either way, the job had a shockingly high turnover rate. And not because people quit. But here's the truly insane part. Even when the taster survived, it didn't always mean the food was safe. Poisons could be slow-acting. Some toxins took hours, even days, to show symptoms. So a taster could sample the king's dinner, feel fine, give the all clear, and then drop dead 2 days later, while the king, who'd eaten a much larger portion, was already violently ill. To combat this, some courts employed multiple tasters, belt and suspenders. If the first taster didn't die, great. But just to be sure, let's have a second one try it, and maybe a third. It was like poison detection by committee, and the tasters knew this. They knew they weren't foolproof. They knew that even if they did their job perfectly, they could still fail. Because in the end, they weren't protecting the king with skill or intelligence. They were protecting him by being willing to die first. In some courts, tasters were required to eat in front of the entire dining hall, a public spectacle designed to reassure guests that the meal was safe. Imagine that. You're standing on a platform surrounded by nobles in velvet and silk, and you're chewing a piece of venison while everyone watches in silence, waiting to see if you keel over. It's like a very morbid dinner theatre. There were a few perks, if you can call them that. Tasters often had access to information. They knew which dishes the king preferred, which visiting nobles were being served the what, and which foods were considered risky. This made them valuable sources of gossip. They also occasionally got to eat genuinely excellent food, assuming it didn't kill them. But mostly it was just terrifying. And if you think this job disappeared once people got smarter and more civilized, think again. Food tasters existed well into the 20th century. Adolf Hitler famously employed 15 young women to taste his meals because he was paranoid about assassination. They were forced to eat every meal before him, and they lived in constant terror. One of them survived the war and later said the job was psychological torture. So yes, being a royal food taster was humanity's worst job description. You didn't get to enjoy the food. You didn't get respect. You didn't even get job security. You got a spoon, a prayer, and the knowledge that every bite might be your last. And yet, someone had to do it. Because in the world of royalty, where everyone smiled with knives behind their backs, trust was a luxury no one could afford. Except, apparently, trust in the poor bastard who had to eat first. Here's a fun rule. At a royal banquet, nobody, and I mean nobody, was allowed to start eating before the monarch took the first bite. It didn't matter if you'd been sitting there for 2 hours watching your roasted swan get cold. You sat, you smiled. You pretended your stomach wasn't eating itself. The king might take his sweet time, chatting, sipping wine, or just staring dramatically into the middle distance because he could. You're seated at a long oak table in a grand hall. Tapestries hang on the walls, candles flicker in elaborate candelabras, musicians play softly in the corner, something with lutes that's supposed to be soothing, but mostly just makes you want to scream. In front of you sits a plate loaded with food, venison glazed with wine sauce, roasted vegetables glistening with butter, bread still warm from the oven. Your mouth is watering. Your stomach is staging a full-scale rebellion, and you can't touch any of it. Why? Because 30 feet away at the head of the table, the king is busy. He's talking to a visiting ambassador about grain taxes or border disputes or something equally riveting. He's gesturing with his wine goblet. He's laughing at his own jokes. He hasn't even glanced at his food. And until he does, you're stuck in purgatory, staring at your dinner like it's a museum exhibit. This wasn't just etiquette. This was law. In many European courts, beginning to eat before the monarch was considered an act of profound disrespect. It suggested you thought you were equal to the king, or worse, that you didn't care about his authority. People had been banished for less. Some had been imprisoned, One particularly unfortunate duke reportedly lost his estates after absent-mindedly taking a bite of bread before the queen had been served. So you wait, and you wait, and you keep waiting. Let's talk logistics. Royal banquets weren't quick affairs. They were marathon events, sometimes lasting 4 to 6 hours, and the food didn't all arrive at once. No, it came in waves, course after course after course, each one meticulously timed and presented with theatrical flair. The problem was the timing was based entirely on the king's pace. If he wanted to spend 45 minutes telling a hunting story between the fish course and the meat course, everyone else just had to sit there, forks poised, stomachs growling, trying to look fascinated. And here's where it gets even more absurd. The rule didn't just apply to eating, it applied to drinking too. You couldn't sip your wine until the king had taken his first drink. You couldn't even touch your goblet. Some courts were so strict that servants would physically remove your cup if you reached for it prematurely. It's like being at a restaurant where the waiter slaps your hand every time you try to drink water before the chef takes a sip first. Imagine you're a minor noble, maybe a baron or a count, invited to dine with the king. You've travelled for days to get here. You've put on your finest velvet doublet, the one that cost more than your horse. You've rehearsed your small talk. You're seated finally at the royal table. The food arrives. It smells incredible. Rosemary, garlic, butter. Your body is screaming, eat. But you can't, because the king is busy knighting someone, or discussing theology with a bishop, or just sitting there, staring at a chandelier, lost in thought. Minutes tick by. Your meat congeals. Your sauce develops a skin. The bread hardens. And still, you wait. Now some clever guests tried to game the system. They'd eat a huge meal before arriving at the banquet, figuring they could coast through the evening on a full stomach. But this backfired spectacularly. Because when the food finally came, they were expected to eat enthusiastically. Refusing food was an insult. So now you're sitting there, already stuffed, forcing down course after course while trying not to vomit into your napkin. Congratulations, you played yourself. Other guests tried the opposite approach. They'd starve themselves all day, arriving ravenous, ready to demolish whatever was put in front of them. This also backfired, because now you're so hungry that waiting becomes physical torture. Your hands start shaking, you get lightheaded, you're eyeing the decorative fruit centerpiece like it's an acceptable meal. You're one missed meal away from gnawing on the table leg. And the king, oh, he knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't accidental, this was power. Making people wait to eat was a flex. It reminded everyone at the table who was in charge. It didn't matter if you were a duke, a general, or a visiting prince. If the king wanted to make you sit there for an hour staring at cold duck, you sat there and stared, and you smiled while doing it. Some monarchs took this to sadistic extremes. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, was infamous for this. He'd host elaborate banquets and deliberately delay eating just to watch his courtiers squirm. He'd call people over for conversations, ask detailed questions about their estates, their families, their opinions on architecture, all while his guests' dinners slowly transformed into decorative wax sculptures. And if you showed even a flicker of impatience, if you sighed, or shifted in your seat, or glanced longingly at your plate, that was noted. You'd just earned yourself a reputation as someone who couldn't control themselves, someone undignified, someone who probably shouldn't be invited back. But wait, it gets worse. In some courts, the rule extended beyond the banquet itself. The king's eating schedule dictated the entire palace. If the king decided to sleep in and skip breakfast, the whole court skipped breakfast. If he wanted dinner at 10 o'clock at night, everyone ate at 10 o'clock. Your personal preferences, your hunger, your body's digestive schedule, none of that mattered. You synchronized your stomach to the monarch's whims or you went hungry. There are records of courtiers fainting at banquets. Actually fainting. From hunger, from standing too long in tight clothing, from the sheer stress of watching food go cold while their body screamed for calories. And they'd be carried out quietly, discreetly, so as not to disturb the king's meal. The show had to go on. The servers had it worst of all. They had to stand there, holding platters of hot food, sometimes for an hour or more, waiting for the signal to serve. Their arms burned. The dishes got heavier, and if they dropped something, if their grip slipped for even a second, they'd be dismissed. Possibly beaten, definitely humiliated. Even children weren't exempt. Young nobles learning court etiquette were taught this rule early. Sit still. Don't touch your food. Wait for the king. There are accounts of children, some as young as 7 or 8, sitting through multi-hour banquets with tears streaming down their faces from hunger and exhaustion. But they didn't move, because the alternative, disgracing their family by breaking protocol, was unthinkable. And here's the kicker. Sometimes the king didn't eat at all. Maybe he wasn't feeling well. Maybe he'd already eaten privately. Maybe he just wasn't hungry. Didn't matter. The banquet still happened. The food was still served, and everyone still had to wait for him to take that first symbolic bite, which he might never take. So you'd sit there, surrounded by an untouched feast, watching it slowly spoil, knowing that at the end of the night it would all be cleared away and fed to the dogs. This is what dining with royalty actually looked like. Not glamorous, not indulgent. Just an endurance test disguised as a dinner party, where your reward for good behaviour was permission to eat food that had been sitting out for 2 hours. So the next time you're at a restaurant and your food takes 20 minutes to arrive and you're annoyed, just remember, at least you don't have to wait for a monarch in a powdered wig to chew first. You'd think a napkin is just a napkin, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. In royal courts, napkins were a battlefield of social hierarchy. The quality, size, and even how it was folded told everyone exactly where you ranked. If you were the king, your napkin was practically a tablecloth. Massive, embroidered, probably imported from somewhere expensive and vaguely Italian. You're sitting at that same banquet table, still waiting for the king to take his first bite, and a servant approaches with napkins on a silver tray. But here's the thing, they're not all the same. Not even close. The servant knows exactly who gets what. There's a whole system, a napkin caste structure, and everyone in the room understands it instinctively. The king's napkin is absurd. We're talking 4 feet long, made of the finest linen, possibly trimmed with lace, embroidered with the royal coat of arms in gold thread. It's been bleached to an impossible whiteness, and pressed so precisely that it could probably stand up on its own. It's draped across his lap with ceremony, positioned by a designated napkin servant. Yes, that was a real job, whose sole purpose is to handle the royal cloth with reverence. Meanwhile, your napkin, if you're a minor noble seated near the back, it's about the size of a modern hand towel, plain, unadorned, possibly recycled from last week's banquet. It's been laundered, sure, but not with the same care. There might be a faint wine stain in the corner that nobody bothered to fully scrub out, and you're grateful for it. Because some people at the table don't get napkins at all, that's right. The lowest ranking attendees, the hangers-on, the plus ones who barely scraped an invitation, they got nothing, no napkin. They were expected to wipe their hands on their own clothing, or if they were really desperate, on the tablecloth, which by the way was also hierarchical. The section of tablecloth nearest the king was pristine damask. Your section? Coarser linen that had seen better days, but the size and quality of the napkin were only part of the story. The real power move was in the folding. And, oh, did they fold. Royal napkin folding became an art form, a competitive sport, a way to demonstrate that your household had too much money and too much time. Napkins were folded into shapes, ships, castles, animals, flowers, abstract geometric nightmares that required an engineering degree to understand. At some particularly extravagant banquets, napkins were folded into swans, complete with outstretched wings and gracefully curved necks. Or they'd be shaped like bishops' mitres, sitting tall and pointed on each plate. The more elaborate the fold, the more important you were. It was like origami, but with class warfare. And here's where it gets truly ridiculous. They were professional napkin folders, people whose entire job was to fold cloth. They trained for years, learning dozens of different techniques, studying under master folders like they were apprenticing with Renaissance sculptors. Some royal households kept illustrated manuals, actual books, showing hundreds of napkin folding patterns, complete with step-by-step diagrams. Now imagine you're a guest at this banquet. You sit down. In front of you is a napkin folded into the shape of a peacock. It's beautiful. It's intricate. It probably took someone 20 minutes to construct. And you're supposed to unfold it? And wipe your mouth with it? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. You're essentially being asked to destroy a piece of art so you can dab grease off your chin. But you have to do it. because not using your napkin is also an insult. It suggests the food isn't messy enough to require one, which implies the food isn't rich or indulgent enough, which implies the host is cheap. So you carefully, apologetically, dismantle the peacock and spread it across your lap feeling like a barbarian. Meanwhile, the king's napkin isn't just folded, it's staged. At some French court banquets under Louis XIV, the royal napkin was presented with fanfare. A servant would approach, bow deeply, and unfold the napkin with a flourish, like a matador revealing his cape. The napkin would then be draped across the king's lap by another servant, who would adjust it with the precision of a surgeon. The king himself never touched it. Touching your own napkin? Peasant behaviour. And let's talk about what happened to these napkins after the meal. The king's napkin was whisked away, laundered with obsessive care and sometimes never used again. It was retired, like a sports jersey. Some royal napkins were kept as keepsakes, stored in special chests, displayed like relics. Your napkin, washed and reused. Probably for the servants' meals. But the hierarchy didn't stop at the dinner table. Even in everyday life, napkins signalled status. Wealthy nobles carried personal napkins with them, tucked into belts or pockets, embroidered with their family crests. Whipping out your napkin in public was a flex. It said, "I'm so refined. I brought my own cloth to wipe my hands, because I refused to touch my face with anything communal." There were also rules about how to use your napkin. You couldn't just scrub your face with it like you were washing a window. No, you dabbed. Gently, delicately. The napkin was supposed to barely touch your lips, just enough to absorb a hint of moisture. If you actually wiped your mouth, like really wiped it, you were doing it wrong. That was coarse, unrefined, the kind of thing a merchant might do, and God forbid you blew your nose into your napkin. That was an unforgivable sin, even though people absolutely did it. Court etiquette manuals from the 16th and 17th centuries are filled with instructions explicitly telling people not to blow their noses into napkins, which means it was happening enough that someone felt the need to write it down and say, "Stop it." In some courts, there were different napkins for different courses. You'd start the meal with one napkin, then halfway through, a servant would swap it out for a fresh one. Because heaven forbid you wipe your mouth on a napkin that had already touched your mouth. The logic here is baffling, but it reinforced the point. Excess was the point. Waste was status. If you could afford to use 3 napkins during a single meal, you were winning. There are even records of napkin theft. Yes, theft. Because high-quality napkins were genuinely valuable. They were made from expensive fabric, often embroidered or monogrammed, and they lasted for years. Guests at banquets would occasionally slip napkins into their pockets as souvenirs. Some hosts caught on and started counting napkins before and after meals, like they were running a linen inventory at a hotel. And if you think this is all ancient history, think again. Napkin hierarchy survived well into the 20th century. At formal state dinners, even today, the size and quality of your napkin still varies based on where you're seated. The closer you are to the head of state, the fancier your napkin. It's subtler now. Nobody's folding napkins into swan shapes anymore, thankfully, but the principle remains. But here's the part that really gets me. All of this entire elaborate system of napkin-based social ranking, was built on the idea that some people's hands were more important than others. That the king's fingers were so precious, so sacred, that they required cloth woven by angels and blessed by priests. While everyone else's hands, sure, wipe them on whatever. A rag, your sleeve, the dog. It wasn't about hygiene. It wasn't even really about luxury. It was about control, about making sure everyone in the room knew exactly where they stood, down to the thread count of the fabric on their lap. So the next time you grab a paper napkin at a fast food restaurant and crumple it up without thinking, take a moment to appreciate the fact that nobody's judging you. Nobody's measuring your napkin against someone else's. Nobody's writing your name in a book of social failures because your napkin wasn't embroidered. Because in the world of royal dining, even the cloth you use to wipe your face could ruin your reputation. By the Renaissance, European courts had decided that touching food with your bare hands was vulgar, peasant-like, and frankly disgusting. Never mind that forks were still relatively new and most people didn't trust them. The rule was clear: use utensils. But here's where it gets ridiculous. This rule didn't apply to everyone equally. You're at the banquet table again. The king has finally taken his first bite. You've unfolded your hierarchical napkin. Now comes the actual eating part. You reach for a piece of roasted chicken on your plate. Your fingers are literally inches away when a sharp cough from across the table stops you cold. You look up. A higher-ranking noble is staring at you with the kind of disgust usually reserved for someone who just sneezed into the wine pitcher. You've committed a cardinal sin. You almost touched your food with your hands. The rule was simple in theory. At formal meals you used utensils. Knife and spoon were standard. Fork, if you were fancy and forward-thinking. But under no circumstances were you to pick up food with your bare fingers. That's what animals did. That's what peasants did in their hovels while eating pottage out of wooden bowls. You were nobility. You had standards. You had silverware. Use it. Except this rule was completely exhausting to follow, because Renaissance food wasn't exactly fork-friendly. We're talking whole roasted birds, hunks of meat still on the bone, slippery fruits, sticky pastries. Try eating a whole quail with just a knife and spoon. Go ahead, I'll wait. It's like trying to perform surgery with gardening tools. But you had to try. You'd saw at your meat with your knife, attempting to cut pieces small enough to spear with your spoon, because again, forks weren't universal yet. You'd chase vegetables around your plate like you were playing a very sophisticated game of hockey. You'd try to delicately scoop up sauce-covered items without splattering your velvet doublet. And the whole time, you couldn't use your hands, not even to steady the meat while you cut it. That would be cheating. Meanwhile, 20 feet away, the king was eating a roasted leg of lamb with his bare hands, just grabbing it, tearing into it like he was at a Renaissance fair, grease running down his fingers, and nobody said a word, because he was the king. This is the part that makes the whole system insane. The rules about not touching food only applied to people who weren't powerful enough to ignore them. Monarchs could eat however they wanted. They could pick up meat, lick their fingers, gnaw on bones, and wipe their hands on their clothes if they felt like it. It wasn't vulgar when they did it. It was royal prerogative. Some kings took this to absurd lengths. Henry VIII of England was famous for eating with his hands at banquets, making a deliberate show of it. He'd grab whole joints of meat, rip them apart, and toss bones over his shoulder for the dogs. This wasn't because he didn't know better. It was a power move. It said, "I'm so far above the rules that I can break them in front of you, and you have to sit there and pretend it's normal. But if you, a mere earl or baron, tried the same thing, social suicide. You'd be labelled as crude, unrefined, someone who clearly didn't belong in polite society. Your family would be embarrassed. Your invitations to future events would mysteriously stop arriving. So you sat there, struggling with your utensils, watching your food get cold, while the king across the table ate like a Viking at a feast. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. And it wasn't just about hands versus utensils. There were rules about which utensils you could use for which foods. Certain meats required knives, others required spoons. Fruits had their own specialized picks and forks. Using the wrong utensil was nearly as bad as using your hands. You needed a mental flowchart just to eat a salad. Etiquette manuals from the period are filled with increasingly desperate instructions. One Italian guide from the 1500s spends 3 pages explaining the proper way to eat a pear without touching it. Spoiler, it involves a knife, a spoon, a steady hand, and the kind of focus usually reserved for defusing bombs. Another manual explains that if you absolutely must touch food, say, to break bread, you should use only your thumb and first 2 fingers, keeping your other fingers raised delicately, like you're holding an invisible teacup, because apparently using all 5 fingers was excessive. Only peasants used their whole hand. Refined people used 3 fingers, maximum. This is real. People actually thought about this. And bread was its own nightmare. Bread was technically finger food. You were allowed to touch it, but only in very specific ways. You couldn't grab a whole roll. You had to break off small, delicate pieces, using just the tips of your fingers, and you couldn't bite directly into the bread. Oh no. You had to place the small piece in your mouth gently, like you were feeding a baby bird. If you ripped into a bread roll like a normal human being, you might as well have announced that your ancestors were stable workers. But let's talk about the foods that were genuinely impossible to eat without hands. Shellfish, for instance. Oysters, clams, mussels. These were delicacies served at the finest banquets, and they required fingers to open, to extract the meat, to navigate. So what happened? A compromise. Special finger bowls were provided. You could use your hands, but immediately after you had to dip your fingers in the bowl of water, often scented with rose petals or lemon, to cleanse yourself of the shame. It was like a tiny baptism after every culinary sin. Fruits were another disaster. Try eating a fig with a spoon. Try eating grapes without touching them. It can't be done. So elaborate fruit forks were invented. Tiny, delicate, twee little things with 2 or 3 prongs, designed specifically for spearing berries and melon cubes. If you didn't have one, you were out of luck. You just stared at the grapes longingly, like a medieval Tantalus. And chicken wings. Dear God, chicken wings! These were served at banquets regularly. Whole roasted birds carved tableside, wings intact, and you were expected to eat them with a knife and fork. Have you ever tried to eat a chicken wing with a knife and fork? It's not food at a point. It's an engineering challenge. The bones don't cooperate. The meat clings to the cartilage. You end up mangling the thing into an unrecognisable mess while trying to maintain your dignity. Some nobles gave up entirely and just didn't eat certain foods at banquets. They'd go hungry rather than risk looking foolish. Better to starve elegantly than to be caught wrestling with a drumstick like a commoner. There are records of the younger nobles practising at home, spending hours learning how to eat difficult foods with utensils before attending important dinners. Parents would drill their children. No, you're holding the spoon wrong. You'll embarrass us. Try again. It was like preparing for an exam, except the test was eating, and failing meant social exile. Servants, meanwhile, were watching all of this. They'd serve the food, then stand along the walls, trying not to laugh as nobles performed elaborate acrobatics with silverware, attempting to eat a simple meal without touching it. The servants ate in the kitchens later with their hands like reasonable people. And here's the ultimate irony. Even the people enforcing these rules knew they were absurd. Etiquette manuals from the period occasionally include little asides, moments of self-awareness where the author seems to acknowledge that yes, this is all ridiculous, but we're doing it anyway because society has collectively agreed to this madness. One French etiquette guide from the 1600s actually says, and I'm paraphrasing, "It is best to eat with utensils, though one must admit this is sometimes impossible, in which case one should use one's hands as discreetly as possible and pretend it didn't happen." That's not etiquette. That's a conspiracy. So there you are at your banquet, sawing away at a piece of duck with a spoon, watching the king eat ribs with his bare hands, wondering how you ended up in a world where touching food is a class crime but watching a monarch lick grease off his fingers is considered normal. And the worst part? You're still hungry, because you've spent so much time trying to eat correctly that you've barely consumed anything. Your food is cold, your hands are cramping from gripping the utensils, and you still have 14 more courses to go. Welcome to fine dining Renaissance style, where eating isn't about nourishment. It's about proving you're better than the person next to you, one awkward knife stroke at a time. When forks first appeared in Europe, imported from the Byzantine Empire around the 11th century, they were met with suspicion, mockery, and genuine fear. The Catholic Church wasn't thrilled. Some clergy actually called forks blasphemous and the devil's instrument, arguing that God gave us fingers for a reason. Let's set the scene. You're a European noble in the year 1004. A Venetian merchant has just married a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulou, and she's brought some of her customs with her. One evening, at a formal dinner, she pulls out a small golden implement with 2 prongs. Instead of eating with her hands like a normal person, she uses this strange device to delicately spear her food and bring it to her mouth. The room goes silent. People stare. Someone gasps. A priest in the corner makes the sign of the cross. This is the fork's dramatic entrance into Western Europe, and it went over about as well as a plague announcement. The objections were immediate and loud. Church officials were particularly horrified. Their reasoning? God had given humans hands and fingers. Those were the tools intended for eating. Using a fork, especially a fancy, expensive foreign fork, was an act of pride, vanity, and an insult to divine design. It was like saying God's plan wasn't good enough for you, that you needed your own miniature pitchfork to improve on his work. One particularly fired-up clergyman in Venice called the fork an instrument of excessive delicacy. Another said it was proof of sinful refinement. The implication was clear. If you needed a fork to eat, you were probably going to hell, preferably carried there by tiny demons wielding even tinier forks. And when Maria Argyropoulou died of the plague a few years later, some religious authorities literally said it was God's punishment for her fork usage. That's right. They looked at a plague death and said, well, she did use a fork that one time, probably related. The logic was airtight. Terrifying, but airtight. So forks didn't catch on. For centuries they remained a bizarre foreign curiosity that most Europeans actively avoided. Using one marked you as pretentious, possibly heretical, and definitely weird. It was like showing up to a medieval feast with a selfie stick. Sure, it's a tool, but why would you? But here's the thing. Forks are actually useful. Shockingly useful. They let you eat hot food without burning your fingers. They let you stab slippery items that would otherwise slide off your knife. They give you precision and control. Once a few brave souls started using them, quietly, discreetly, probably while glancing over their shoulders, word began to spread. By the 16th century, forks were making a slow, cautious comeback. Italian nobles, always the trendsetters, started adopting them at banquets. The French followed, though they were sceptical at first. The English held out the longest, clinging to knives and fingers with the stubbornness of a nation that still measures things in stones. But even as forks gained acceptance, they were controversial. Etiquette writers couldn't agree on how to use them. Some said you should hold the fork in your left hand, tines down, and use it only to steady food while cutting with your knife. Others said you could actually spear food with it, but only certain foods. Meat? Sure. Vegetables? Maybe. Bread? Absolutely not. Bread was still finger food, and using a fork on it was considered absurd. There were also debates about how many tines a proper fork should have. 2, 3, 4. Each number had its advocates and its critics. 2-tined forks were considered elegant but impractical. Food kept sliding off. 3-tined forks were sturdier but looked clunky. 4-tined forks were dismissed as excessive. Who needs 4 tines? What are you trying to do? Eat a whole chicken at once? Spoiler, 4 tines won. We use them to this day. But it took centuries of heated debate to get there. Then there was the question of materials. Early forks were made from precious metals. Gold, silver, sometimes even carved from ivory. They were expensive status symbols, not practical eating tools. Owning a fork meant you had money to burn on unnecessary luxuries. It was the Renaissance equivalent of buying a gold-plated iPhone. But this created a new problem: fork theft. Yes, theft. At banquets, guests would sometimes pocket the fancy forks and take them home as souvenirs. Hosts started assigning servants to watch the silverware like hawks. Some households began using cheaper forks for guests and reserving the good ones for family only. The whole thing turned into a paranoid game of cutlery surveillance. And let's talk about the learning curve. Forks aren't intuitive if you've never used one before. You have to figure out the right angle, the right amount of pressure, the right way to balance food on the tines. Early adopters stabbed themselves in the gums. They launched peas across the table. They dropped food in their laps. Using a fork required practice, coordination, and a willingness to look like an idiot while you figured it out. Etiquette manuals from the 1600s are filled with increasingly desperate fork instructions. Hold the fork thus. Do not wave it about. Do not use it as a pointer. Do not stab your neighbour, even in jest. That last one appeared in multiple guides, which suggests it was a genuine problem. People were so excited about their new forks that they were treating them like swords. In England, the fork resistance lasted well into the 17th century. English diners mocked Italians and French courtiers for their effeminate use of forks. Real men, they argued, ate with their hands or with a knife. Forks were for dandies and people who were afraid of getting their fingers dirty. King James I of England reportedly refused to use a fork, calling it an affront to manly dignity. He preferred to tear into his food like his Tudor ancestors, grease and all. But even the English eventually caved. By the 1700s, forks were standard at upper-class tables across Europe. The holdouts were finally outnumbered, and once forks became normal, the people who'd resisted them longest suddenly became their most obnoxious advocates. Oh, you're still eating with your hands. How barbaric. How medieval. Don't you have a fork? The fork had completed its journey from satanic instrument to mark of sophistication. The same clergy who'd condemned it now used it at their own meals, conveniently forgetting they'd ever called it the devil's pitchfork. But forks created new problems. Now there were rules about fork usage. Which fork for which course, how to hold it, where to place it when you weren't using it. The simplicity of eating with your hands was replaced by a complex system of fork choreography that required memorization and constant vigilance. Different countries developed different fork styles. The British held their forks tines down and never switched hands. The Americans held theirs tines up and switched hands constantly, in what Europeans called the zigzag method. The continental Europeans held theirs tines down and considered the American method bizarre and inefficient. Wars have been fought over less. And the truly insane part, once forks became mandatory, people forgot they'd ever lived without them. Within a few generations, the idea of eating with your hands, something humans had done for literally thousands of years, became disgusting and unthinkable. The fork had won so completely that it erased its own controversial history. By the 19th century, there were specialised forks for everything. Fish forks, oyster forks, salad forks, dessert forks, fruit forks, cake forks. Some elaborate place settings included 7 or 8 different forks, each with a specific purpose, each positioned precisely on the table according to the order they'd be used. Getting the fork order wrong was a social disaster. Using your salad fork for your fish course? Shameful. Eating dessert with your dinner fork? Unforgivable. You needed a degree in cutlery just to get through a meal without embarrassing yourself. And all of this entire elaborate system of fork-based social anxiety, stemmed from an implement that had once been condemned as an affront to God. The same tool that had been mocked as unnecessary and pretentious was now so essential that not knowing how to use it properly could ruin your reputation. So there you are, at your royal banquet, holding a fork that your great-great-grandfather would have considered a one-way ticket to hell. You're using it to delicately spear a piece of asparagus, while trying to remember which of the 4 forks in front of you is the correct one for this course. And across the table, someone's judging you because you're holding it at a slightly wrong angle. The fork had gone from satanic to essential in just a few centuries, and in doing so, it proved something important about human nature. We'll embrace anything, no matter how controversial, as long as everyone else is doing it. Even if it did start as the devil's utensil. In some royal courts, refusing food was seen as a massive insult. If the king's chef prepared 27 courses and you only ate 5, you weren't just being rude. You were suggesting the food wasn't good enough for you. Or worse, that you suspected poison. Either way, bad look. You're seated at yet another elaborate banquet. The servants are bringing out course after course after course. Roasted meats, stewed vegetables, fish prepared 17 different ways, pies stuffed with God knows what, jellies that wobble ominously, and you're expected to eat all of it. Not taste it, not sample it politely, eat it, finish it, clean your plate like your life depends on it, because, well, it might. Let's start with the basic math. A formal royal banquet could easily feature 20 to 30 courses, sometimes more. We're not talking small tapas-sized portions either. These were substantial servings, each one designed to showcase the wealth and generosity of the host. A whole roasted peacock here, a platter of venison there, a pie the size of a small child. And you were expected to make a dent in every single one. Your stomach, your body's digestive capacity, your increasing certainty that you're about to vomit into your hierarchical napkin. Irrelevant. You ate. You smiled. You asked for seconds if you were smart. Because refusing food wasn't just impolite, it was suspicious. It raised questions. Why aren't they eating? Do they know something we don't? Did they hear a rumour about the cook? Are they implying the food is beneath them? Are they secretly plotting against the host? Paranoia ran deep in royal courts. Everyone was always watching everyone else, looking for signs of disloyalty, ambition, or treachery. And your eating habits were part of that surveillance. If you picked at your food, pushed it around your plate, or heaven forbid, declined a dish entirely, people noticed. And they drew conclusions. The most dangerous conclusion? You suspected poison. Because if you refused the king's food, it suggested you had reason to believe it might kill you, which meant either you'd been warned by a co-conspirator, or you were planning something yourself and assumed others were doing the same. Either way, you just put a target on your back, so you ate. Even if the fish smelled off, even if the sauce had separated into something that looked like curdled regret, even if your body was screaming that it couldn't handle another bite, you ate because the alternative was worse. And here's the truly horrifying part. Sometimes the food actually was poisoned. Not often, but often enough that the fear was justified. Political assassinations via poisoned food were a real, documented method of removing inconvenient people. Rival nobles, ambitious relatives, enemy states, they all had access to the kitchens if they bribed the right person. So you'd sit there, forcing down course after course, genuinely unsure whether this meal was going to be your last. But you couldn't show fear. You couldn't hesitate, because hesitation looked like guilt, and guilt got you thrown in a dungeon or worse. Some nobles developed strategies. They'd eat quickly, reasoning that if the food was poisoned, at least they'd get it over with. Others ate slowly, watching the people around them for signs of distress. If someone across the table started sweating or clutching their stomach, maybe you could quietly stop eating and claim you were full. But that was risky. Because what if they were just having indigestion? Now you've refused food for no reason and everyone thinks you're paranoid. The safest strategy was to eat enthusiastically and hope for the best. Compliment the food. Loudly. Delicious. Truly exceptional. The king's chef has outdone himself. It didn't matter if the food tasted like salted leather, you praised it. Because praise was loyalty and loyalty was survival. But let's talk about the sheer volume of food you were expected to consume. 27 courses sounds insane, and it was, but it gets worse when you realise these weren't evenly spaced. Sometimes multiple courses would arrive simultaneously. You'd have fish, meat, and pastries all on the table at once, and you were supposed to sample all of them before the next wave arrived. Your plate became a battlefield. You'd take a bite of duck, then a bite of salmon, then a bite of some kind of vegetable medley, then a bite of bread, cycling through everything in a desperate attempt to keep up. Meanwhile, servants kept bringing more food. The table sagged under the weight of it all, platters piled on platters, bowls stacked on bowls, and you couldn't ask them to stop, that would be insulting. The host wanted to demonstrate abundance, generosity, and wealth. Asking for less food was like telling them they were poor. You'd be the person who suggested the king couldn't afford to feed his guests properly. Career-ending stuff. Some nobles tried to cheat the system. They'd eat a few bites from each dish, then discreetly push the rest to the edge of their plate where servants would remove it. But sharp-eyed hosts noticed this. Some even instructed their servants not to clear plates until they were completely empty. So now you're stuck staring at half a roasted quail, knowing you can't leave the table until it's gone. Other guests attempted to hide food. They'd slip pieces of meat into their napkins, planning to dispose of them later. But this backfired spectacularly if anyone saw you. Now you're the person stuffing food into your napkin at a royal banquet. Congratulations. You look like you're either stealing food or preparing to poison someone else. Either way, you're getting questioned by guards later. There are actual historical accounts of nobles becoming violently ill at banquets from overeating. They'd excuse themselves, stumble outside, vomit discreetly behind a hedge, then return to the table and keep eating. Because leaving permanently meant admitting defeat. Better to empty your stomach and start over than to insult the host by abandoning the meal. Some courts employed a compromise, the credence table. This was a side table where food was placed before being served. Servants would taste everything first, right there in front of the guests to prove it wasn't poisoned. Only after the servant survived would the food be brought to the main table. But even this didn't solve the overeating problem. You still had to eat everything. The credence table just meant you could eat yourself into a coma with confidence that it probably wouldn't kill you. Probably. And let's talk about the foods that were genuinely difficult to stomach. Medieval and Renaissance cuisine wasn't subtle. They loved strong flavours, heavy spices, fermented ingredients, aged meats that modern health inspectors would condemn on sight. Some dishes were deliberately challenging, designed to prove you were sophisticated enough to appreciate them. Lamprey eels, for example. King Henry I of England reportedly died from eating too many lampreys, but they remained a delicacy for centuries after. They were served whole, swimming in their own oil, looking like something from a nightmare. And if one ended up on your plate, you ate it, with a smile, or songbirds, tiny birds, roasted whole, bones and all. You were supposed to crunch through the entire thing. The bones were considered the best part, full of flavour. Never mind that you felt like you were eating a handful of tiny toothpicks. You crunched and pretended it was delightful. Some banquets featured joke dishes, foods designed to surprise or confuse. A pie that, when cut open, released live birds. A roasted pig with a smaller roasted pig inside it. A dish that looked like one thing but tasted like another, and you had to react appropriately. Too much surprise and you looked unsophisticated. Too little and you looked bored. It was culinary psychological warfare. The worst part was dessert. By the time dessert arrived, often the final 5 or 6 courses, you were beyond full. You'd entered a realm of physical suffering where breathing felt optional, and your corset or doublet was actively trying to kill you. But dessert was mandatory, sugar was expensive, and serving elaborate sweet dishes was a massive flex. Refusing them was unthinkable. So you ate candied fruits. You ate marzipan sculptures. You ate custards and tarts and sugar paste castles. Your teeth screamed. Your stomach staged a full rebellion, and you kept going, because somewhere between course 22 and course 23 you'd stopped being a person and become a competitive eater at the world's most dangerous food festival. There are records of people dying from overeating at royal banquets. Not from poison, from sheer gastronomic excess. Their bodies just gave up, and you know what the courts did? They kept hosting massive banquets, because the show had to go on, and if a few nobles exploded like overstuffed sausages along the way, well, that was the price of refinement. So there you sit, fork in hand, staring at your 24th course, wondering if this is how it ends. Not in battle, not in a duel, not from poison, but from eating too much roasted swan at a dinner party you didn't even want to attend, and you take another bite. Because refusing isn't an option. Because your reputation depends on it. Because somewhere, the king is watching, and he wants to see you suffer gracefully. Welcome to royal dining, where the food might kill you, but refusing it definitely will. At medieval and Renaissance banquets, the salt cellar, a fancy container holding salt, was placed in the centre of the table. And here's where things got weirdly territorial. Your seat relative to the salt determined your social rank. If you sat above the salt, closer to the king, you were important. Below the salt, you were basically furniture. You walk into the Great Hall for dinner. The table stretches out like a wooden highway lined with chairs and benches. Servants are setting places, arranging plates, positioning utensils, and right in the centre of the table, like a tiny throne, sits the salt cellar. It's enormous, ornate, probably made of silver or gold, possibly shaped like a ship or a castle or some mythological creature. It's not just a condiment holder, it's a landmark, a border, a line in the sand except made of salt. Where you sit in relation to this object will determine how the entire room treats you for the next 4 hours. This wasn't subtle. Everyone knew the system. Above the salt meant you were nobility, clergy, or an honoured guest. You sat near the head of the table, close to the king or lord. You got the best food, the finest wine, the freshest bread. Servants attended to you promptly. People listened when you spoke. You mattered. Below the salt, you were lesser gentry, minor knights, distant relatives who showed up uninvited, or people the host had to invite out of obligation but didn't actually like. You sat far from the action, near the foot of the table where the draught from the door hit hardest. Your food arrived later and colder. Your wine was cheaper. Your napkin, if you got one, was recycled. And when you spoke, people didn't hear you, not because the acoustics were bad, but because they chose not to listen. The salt cellar was a physical manifestation of the social hierarchy, and everyone could see it. There was no hiding where you ranked, no pretending you were more important than you were. Your distance from the salt told the truth. Now, why salt? Because in medieval and Renaissance Europe, salt was valuable, genuinely valuable. It preserved food, enhanced flavour, and was essential for survival. Before refrigeration, salt meant the difference between eating stored meat in winter and starving. It was so important that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, hence the word salary. So placing an elaborate salt cellar at the centre of the table wasn't just decorative, it was symbolic. Salt represented wealth, power, and civilization. The closer you sat to it, the more you shared in that power. The farther away you sat, the less you mattered. And these salt cellars weren't simple shakers, they were works of art. We're talking multi-tiered structures, sometimes over a foot tall, encrusted with jewels, featuring intricate engravings or sculptures. The famous Cellini salt cellar, created for the King of France in 1543, depicted Neptune and a personification of Earth in gold and enamel. It was less a functional object and more a statement. I have so much money that I turned a container for seasoning into a priceless masterpiece. Owning an impressive salt cellar was a flex. Displaying it at your banquets was a power move, and making sure everyone knew their place relative to it was social engineering at its finest. But let's talk about what it felt like to be seated below the salt. You arrive at the banquet dressed in your second best doublet because you know you're not important enough for the first best one. You enter the hall trying to look confident, hoping maybe this time you'll be seated higher up. The steward consults his seating chart. Yes, there was a chart. This was planned, and gestures vaguely toward the lower end of the table. Your heart sinks. You walk past the salt cellar, past the important people, past the nobles chatting and laughing, and you keep walking and walking until finally you reach your seat, so far from the salt that you can barely see it. You're practically in a different room. The nearest neighbour is someone you've never met, probably because they're equally unimportant. You sit. You look down the table toward the salt, toward the light and warmth and laughter, and you realise this is where you belong. In the eyes of your host, you are below the salt people. You're an afterthought, a name on a list, someone who had to be invited but doesn't actually matter, and everyone knows it. The servants know it, so they serve you last. The other guests know it, so they don't bother making conversation. Even the dogs know it. They're sniffing around the head of the table for scraps. Not down here where the food isn't even that good. Some people tried to game the system. They'd arrive early, hoping to grab a seat closer to the salt before anyone noticed. But the steward always noticed, and you'd be asked, politely but firmly, to move. There was no sneaking above the salt. Your seat was assigned based on rank, and rank didn't change just because you showed up early. Others tried flattery. They'd compliment the host excessively in the days leading up to the banquet, hoping for a better seat. Sometimes it worked. More often, it backfired, and the host seated them even lower as punishment for being transparent. The seating arrangement was also political. Hosts used the salt cellar divide to send messages. If you were seated above the salt, it meant you were in favour. If you'd been above the salt last time but were below it this time, that was a warning. Your stock was falling. You better figure out why and fix it before the next banquet, or you might not be invited at all. And if you were a new guest, your first seating was a test. The host was telling you, and everyone else, exactly how much you were worth. If you accepted your below-the-salt status gracefully, you might be invited back. If you complained or looked offended, you'd just confirm that you didn't understand how power worked, and you probably wouldn't get a second chance. The truly cruel part was that the salt cellar itself was often beautiful and fascinating. You could see it from your distant seat, gleaming in the candlelight, and you wanted to look at it more closely, maybe even use it. But you couldn't. Because reaching for the salt when you were seated below it was a breach of etiquette. The salt wasn't for you, it was for them, the important people. If you wanted salt, and you did, because the food down at your end was bland, you had to ask a servant, quietly, apologetically, and the servant might bring you a small dish of lower quality salt, not from the fancy salt cellar, obviously. That salt was reserved for nobility. You got the common stuff. Because even seasoning was hierarchical. Now let's talk about the poor souls seated exactly at the salt, right next to it. This was its own kind of torture, because you were technically above the salt, barely, but everyone could see you were just barely above it. You were the lowest of the high-status guests. You outranked the below-salt people, sure, but you were still at the bottom of the above-salt people. You were in no man's land, socially speaking. These guests often spent the entire meal anxious, trying to prove they belonged. They'd laugh too hard at the king's jokes, They'd compliment the food too enthusiastically. They'd try to start conversations with people seated higher up, who would respond with polite disinterest. It was painful to watch, and the seating arrangement affected everything. The above salt people got entertainment. Musicians positioned themselves near the head of the table. Jugglers and jesters performed for the king and his favourites. If you were below the salt, you got to watch from a distance, straining to hear the jokes, missing the punchlines. The above salt people got better light. The grand chandeliers and torches were concentrated near the head of the table. Below the salt, it was dimmer. You squinted at your food, trying to identify what you were eating. The above salt people got warmth. The fireplaces were at the head of the hall. Below the salt, you shivered in your inadequate doublet, wondering if frostbite was a real concern. Even the tablecloth was different. The section near the salt was pristine white damask, changed after every banquet. Your section? Rougher linen, stained from previous meals, cleaned but not replaced. Because why waste good fabric on people who didn't matter? This system persisted for centuries. The phrase, below the salt, entered common language as shorthand for being lower class or less important. And even today, we still talk about the head of the table and the foot of the table, a linguistic fossil from the salt cellar era. But here's what really gets me. The whole system was designed to be obvious. It wasn't a secret code. It wasn't subtle social signalling. It was a giant golden salt cellar sitting in the middle of the table, literally dividing people into the important and the unimportant, and everyone just accepted it. If you were above the salt, you felt superior. If you were below it, you felt ashamed. And the host sat back, watching everyone internalize their assigned status, knowing that next time people would work even harder for a seat closer to the salt. It was social control through furniture arrangement and a condiment holder, and it worked perfectly. So there you sit, below the salt, eating cold duck with cheap wine, watching the above salt people laugh and feast and exist in a warmer, brighter, better world just a few feet away. And you think, maybe next time. Maybe if you're useful enough, loyal enough, important enough, you'll earn a seat above the salt. But probably not, because in the world of royal banquets, your place is fixed, and the salt cellar makes sure everyone knows it. Royal dining etiquette wasn't just about what you ate. It was about how you breathed while eating it. Sneezing at the table? Scandalous. Coughing? Horrifying. Burping? You might as well have declared war. The expectation was that you'd sit there, silent and still, eating your peacock like a well-dressed statue. You're at the banquet. You've navigated the fork debate, survived the wait for the king to eat, and accepted your position relative to the salt cellar. Now comes the hardest part, existing quietly, because apparently having a human body with human functions was considered deeply offensive to refined society. Let's start with sneezing. You feel it coming. That telltale tickle in your nose. Maybe it's the pepper they dumped on everything. Maybe it's the dust from the tapestries. Maybe it's just bad luck. Either way, a sneeze is building, and you have approximately 3 seconds to prevent a social catastrophe. You can't sneeze, not at the table, not in front of the king. Sneezing was considered one of the most vulgar bodily functions you could commit in polite company. Why? Because it was loud, sudden, uncontrollable, and, worst of all, it sprayed microscopic particles of saliva and mucus into the air. In an era before germ theory, people didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that sneezing near food was disgusting. So what do? You fight it. You press your tongue to the roof of your mouth. You pinch the bridge of your nose. You think about something else. Anything else. You employ every folk remedy you've ever heard for stopping a sneeze, and if none of that works, you turn your head away from the table, bury your face in your hierarchical napkin, and sneeze as quietly as humanly possible while praying nobody heard. But they heard. Everyone heard. The table goes silent. People turn to look. The noble across from you wrinkles his nose in disgust. The servant behind you takes a small step back. You've just committed a faux pas that will be gossiped about for weeks. And God help you if you sneezed on the food, if even a hint of your sneeze reached the communal platters. You've just contaminated the entire course. The servants will remove it. The host will be quietly furious, and you'll be remembered forever as the person who sneezed on the venison at the Duke's banquet. That's your legacy now. That's how you'll be introduced at parties. Oh, you haven't met Lord Sneezes on venison. But sneezing wasn't the only forbidden bodily function. Coughing was almost as bad. Now, here's the problem. In poorly ventilated halls filled with smoke from candles, torches and fireplaces, plus the dust from tapestries and rushes on the floor, everybody's coughing. It's a guarantee. Your throat is dry. The air is thick. You've been eating for 3 hours straight. Your body wants to cough, but you can't. Coughing was considered evidence of poor health, and poor health was suspicious. Are you sick? Contagious? Is this the plague? Should everyone at the table be worried? And if you cough repeatedly, people start wondering if you're choking, which is embarrassing, because choking means you ate wrong, and eating wrong means you're uncivilized. So you suppress it. You swallow hard. You sip your wine carefully, hoping to soothe your throat. You breathe shallowly, trying not to trigger another cough. And when you absolutely must cough, when your body simply won't let you hold it in any longer, you turn away from the table, cover your mouth with your napkin, and produce the quietest, most apologetic cough in human history. Etiquette manuals from the period actually have instructions for this. One 16th century guide says, and I'm paraphrasing, if you must cough, do so with your mouth closed and make no sound. As if the cough is happening to someone else entirely. That's not advice. That's a magic trick. You're supposed to cough silently, internally, like your body is a ventriloquist, and the cough is happening in another room. And burping. Oh, burping. This was the ultimate sin. Burping was considered so offensive, so crude, that some etiquette books didn't even mention it directly. They dance around it with euphemisms like emitting unwanted sounds or allowing the stomach to speak. Because acknowledging that burping existed was itself vulgar. The problem is, when you're eating massive quantities of rich food and drinking carbonated or fermented beverages, burping is inevitable. Your stomach is producing gas. Physics is happening. But physics doesn't care about etiquette, and etiquette doesn't care about physics. You're caught in the middle, desperately trying to suppress a burp while course number 16 slowly digests. If you felt a burp coming, you had options, none of them good. You could try to swallow it back down, which sometimes worked but often just made it worse, turning one small burp into a series of smaller, squeakier burps that were somehow even more embarrassing. You could excuse yourself from the table, but leaving during a meal was also rude unless you had a very good reason, and I need to burp was not considered a very good reason. Or you could try to disguise it. Some people attempted to burp silently, mouth closed, hoping it would just dissipate internally like a sad, trapped balloon. Others tried to time it with loud moments, a musician hitting a dramatic note, a servant dropping something, someone else coughing to mask the sound. It was acoustic camouflage, and it rarely worked. If you did burp audibly, the best strategy was to pretend it didn't happen. Don't acknowledge it. Don't apologize. Don't make eye contact. Just keep eating, stone-faced, as if your body hadn't just betrayed you in front of 24 witnesses. With luck, everyone would politely pretend they didn't hear it either. With luck. But wait, there's more. Hiccuping was also forbidden. Yes, hiccuping. As if you had any control over that. Hiccups were considered comical at best and irritating at worst. They disrupted the refined atmosphere of the banquet, and because hiccups are nearly impossible to stop once they start, getting the hiccups at a royal dinner was a slow-motion disaster. You'd sit there, hiccuping every 30 seconds, trying various folk remedies, holding your breath, drinking water backwards, thinking about your ancestors. Meanwhile, everyone at the table was aware of your hiccups and quietly judging you. Some courts actually had servants whose job was to escort hiccuping guests out of the hall until the hiccups stopped. You'd be led away like you'd committed a crime, all because your diaphragm decided to spasm. Even breathing too loudly was problematic. If you were a heavy breather, maybe because your corset was too tight or your doublet was suffocating, you needed to control it. Loud breathing suggested you were struggling, out of shape, or worse, aroused by the food. Yes, there were actual concerns that heavy breathing while eating made you seem gluttonous or lustful. You were supposed to breathe silently, delicately, as if air was optional. Chewing noises were absolutely forbidden. Your mouth had to remain closed while chewing, no smacking, no lip sounds, no audible grinding of food between teeth. Eating was supposed to be a silent act. If people could hear you chewing from across the table, you'd failed at being human. There are etiquette manuals that specifically instruct people to chew slowly and carefully to avoid making noise. One French guide from the 1600s says, "Chew as if your teeth are made of velvet." Velvet teeth. That's the goal. Soft, silent, theoretical teeth that somehow still break down food. And let's talk about throat sounds. Swallowing, for example. If you swallowed loudly, with an audible gulp that was considered crude, you were supposed to swallow smoothly, silently, like your esophagus was a well-oiled machine operating in stealth mode. Same with clearing your throat. Absolutely not allowed. If you had phlegm, and everyone did, because medieval halls were basically phlegm factories, you dealt with it quietly, internally, or you excused yourself. Now imagine you're sitting at this banquet with a developing cold. Your nose is running, your throat is scratchy. You want to sneeze, cough, and blow your nose every 5 minutes. But you can't do any of those things. You're trapped in a bodily horror show, fighting your own respiratory system while trying to maintain the appearance of effortless grace. Some nobles developed elaborate coping strategies. They'd take tiny, careful bites to avoid choking or coughing. They'd breathe through their mouths discreetly. They'd excuse themselves multiple times throughout the meal under various pretenses. "Forgive me, I must check on my horse," or "Pardon me, I've forgotten something in my chambers," just to step outside and sneeze, cough, and burp like a normal human being before returning to the table. Others medicated themselves beforehand. They'd drink herbal concoctions designed to suppress coughs and calm the stomach. Some of these remedies actually worked. Others contained alcohol and just made people drunk, which created a whole new set of problems, because being visibly intoxicated at a royal banquet was also frowned upon, even though everyone was drinking wine constantly. The truly desperate carried handkerchiefs, not for wiping their mouths, but for emergency sneeze catching. They'd keep one hand near their face at all times, ready to deploy the handkerchief at the first sign of a nasal disturbance. It was like being on high alert for biological warfare, except the warfare was coming from inside your own skull. And here's the absurd part. Everyone at the table was fighting the same battle. Everyone wanted to sneeze, cough, or burp. Everyone was suppressing their body's natural functions. But because everyone was pretending so hard that they didn't have bodies, nobody could acknowledge the shared suffering. You couldn't lean over and whisper, "I really need to cough, this is torture." That would be admitting defeat. So you all sat there, dozens of people silently warring with your own biology, eating your peacock with velvet teeth and swallowing with ghost throats, praying you could make it through dessert without your body staging a full revolt. And if you did make it through, if you successfully ate a 4-hour meal without sneezing, coughing, burping, hiccuping, or breathing too loudly, congratulations. You'd mastered the art of royal dining, which was less about eating and more about pretending you were a sophisticated automaton who didn't require oxygen or have a digestive system. But if you failed, if your body betrayed you even once, you'd spend the rest of the evening knowing that everyone at the table had mentally downgraded your status. You were now the person who sneezed, or the one who couldn't stop coughing, or that noble with the unfortunate burp. And next time, you'd be seated just a little bit farther from the salt. In England, swans belonged to the crown. Literally. All unmarked mute swans in open waters were considered property of the monarchy. This meant that if you, a regular person, decided to roast a swan for dinner, you weren't just breaking a rule, you were committing treason. Yes, treason. Over a bird. Let's be clear about what this means. You're a peasant or even a minor noble in medieval England. You're walking along the Thames minding your own business, and you see a beautiful swan gliding across the water. It's elegant, it's graceful, it's also approximately 15 pounds of potential protein. Your family is hungry, winter is coming, that swan looks delicious. But you can't touch it, because that swan doesn't belong to nature. It doesn't belong to the river. It belongs to the king, and if you kill it, cook it, or even think too hard about eating it, you could be arrested, tried, and executed for stealing royal property. This wasn't a joke. This was actual law. The crown's ownership of swans was established in the 12th century and codified over the following centuries. It became one of the most absurdly specific property laws in English history. All mute swans, those elegant white birds with the orange beaks, were automatically royal property unless they'd been specifically marked as belonging to someone else. And who was allowed to mark swans as their own? Only people the crown gave permission to. Basically, other very wealthy, very powerful individuals who paid for the privilege. So the only people who could legally eat swans were the people who least needed to eat swans. The rich got richer, the swans got eaten by dukes. The system was enforced through swan marks, nicks, cuts, and patterns carved into the birds' beaks to indicate ownership. There was an actual position called the Royal Swan Marker, whose job was to round up swans, mark them, and keep detailed records of who owned which birds. This person took their job seriously. There are surviving records from the 15th and 16th centuries documenting swan ownership with the kind of meticulous detail usually reserved for land deeds. Every year there was an event called swan upping, which still happens today, though it's now more about conservation than dinner. During swan upping, officials would travel up the Thames in boats, catching swans, checking their marks, and adding new marks to cygnets, baby swans. It was like a census, except for birds, and the penalty for fraud was significantly higher than modern tax evasion. Now let's talk about why anyone cared this much about swans, because from a modern perspective, this seems insane. They're just birds. Big birds, sure, but still birds. Why did the monarchy monopolise them? 2 reasons: status and taste. First, swans were symbols of purity, grace, and nobility. They were beautiful, rare, and associated with royalty across European culture. Owning swans was a flex. Eating swans was an even bigger flex. It said, "I'm so powerful that I can consume beauty itself." Second, people genuinely believed swans were delicious. They weren't, for the record. Swan meat is tough, greasy, and has a distinctive fishy flavour, because swans eat a lot of aquatic plants and small fish. Most historical accounts describe it as an acquired taste, which is polite code for kind of terrible, but it was expensive and exclusive, which made it desirable. The medieval equivalent of paying $500 for a truffle that tastes like dirt. At royal banquets, swans were often served as showpieces. They'd be roasted, then redressed in their own feathers to look alive, posed dramatically on the table with their wings spread. It was part meal, part taxidermy, part theatre. Guests would gasp at the presentation, applaud the spectacle, and then gnaw on tough fishy meat while pretending it was amazing. But for regular people, swans were completely off limits, and the penalties were harsh. If you were caught killing a swan, you could be fined a sum that would bankrupt you. If you couldn't pay the fine, you could be imprisoned. And in some cases, particularly if you were already suspected of being disloyal or rebellious, killing a royal swan could be prosecuted as treason. Treason for a bird. The logic went like this. The swan belonged to the king. Killing the king's property was an attack on the king himself. And attacking the king, even indirectly, even through poultry, was treason. The punishment for treason was death. So technically, yes, you could be executed for eating a swan. Did this happen often? Probably not. Most cases of swan theft were handled with fines or imprisonment, but the threat was real, and it kept people in line. Nobody wanted to risk their life over a bird, no matter how hungry they were. There are documented cases of people being prosecuted for swan theft. In 1570, a man named Thomas Arden was hauled before a court for killing 2 swans on the River Medway. He claimed he didn't know they were royal swans. The court didn't care. Ignorance of swan law was not a defence. He was fined heavily and publicly shamed. In another case from the 1490s, a group of poachers killed several swans and tried to sell the meat at a market. They were caught, arrested, and sentenced to time in the pillory, a wooden frame where you'd be locked in place while the public threw rotten vegetables at you. It was humiliating, painful, and a very effective deterrent. The message was clear: don't touch the swans. But people were hungry, and swans were everywhere. They floated around on rivers and ponds looking plump and edible, completely unaware that they were protected by royal decree. The temptation was real. Some people tried to work around the law. They'd claim they found a swan already dead. "I didn't kill it, Your Honour, it just died, and I thought it would be wasteful to let it rot, so I cooked it." For the good of the kingdom. This rarely worked. Dead swans still belonged to the crown, and you were still supposed to report them to the authorities, not roast them with rosemary. Others tried to argue that they'd mistaken the swan for a goose. It looked like a goose, Your Honour, big, white, aggressive. How was I supposed to know? This also rarely worked, because swans and geese look nothing alike if you're being honest. Swans are massive, elegant, and have long curved necks. Geese are smaller, stockier, and have short necks. Confusing the two was like confusing a horse with a donkey and expecting people to believe you. And then there were the truly desperate or truly stupid people who just went for it. They'd kill a swan, cook it quickly, eat it, and destroy the evidence. Maybe they'd get away with it. Maybe the swan marker wouldn't notice one missing bird. Maybe nobody would tell the authorities. But in small communities, people talked. Neighbours noticed things. If you were suddenly cooking a suspiciously large bird, people asked questions. And if someone had a grudge against you, and in medieval England everyone had a grudge against someone, they'd report you. Not because they cared about the swan, but because snitching on you might earn them favour with the local lord or get you out of their way. So eating a swan was risky on multiple levels. Legal risk, social risk, the risk that your neighbour hated you enough to turn you in. Plus, the actual eating experience was disappointing. All that risk for tough, fishy meat that probably gave you indigestion. But the law persisted. For centuries. Even as England modernised, even as other strange medieval laws were repealed, the Crown's ownership of swans remained. Because tradition matters, because symbolism matters, and because once you've established that swans are royal birds, admitting that was a weird idea feels like weakness. To this day, the British monarchy technically still owns all unmarked mute swans in open waters. The law is still on the books. It's not enforced the way it used to be. You won't be executed for eating a swan anymore, but the principle remains. The swans belong to the Crown, and there's something deeply absurd about that. In a modern world with grocery stores and factory farms, where you can buy chicken, beef, pork and fish without anyone caring, the idea that one specific type of bird is off limits because of a medieval property law is ridiculous. But it also tells us something important about how royalty worked. It wasn't just about ruling people. It was about controlling everything. Land, resources, animals, food. If you were king, you didn't just govern the country. You owned it. Every tree, every fish, every swan, and the laws existed to remind everyone of that ownership. So when a peasant looked at a swan and felt hungry, they weren't just looking at a bird. They were looking at a symbol of everything they didn't have and could never touch. That swan represented power, wealth, and a social order that placed them firmly at the bottom. And if they killed it anyway, they weren't just breaking a rule. They were challenging that order, which is why the punishment was so severe. Because it was never really about the swan, it was about control. So the next time you see a swan in a park gliding serenely across a pond, take a moment to appreciate that you live in a time when you could, theoretically, eat it without being executed. You won't, because swan meat is terrible, and also it's probably illegal for other reasons now, but at least it's not treason anymore. Strong-smelling foods like garlic and onions were considered incredibly vulgar in many European royal courts. Why? Because they made you smell like a peasant. Never mind that garlic was delicious and had actual health benefits. If your breath could clear a room, you weren't refined enough for polite society. You're at a royal banquet. The food arrives, elaborately prepared, beautifully presented, probably expensive. You notice something immediately. It's bland. Not subtly seasoned, not delicately flavoured, just bland. There's pepper, sure, maybe some cinnamon or cloves if you're lucky, but there's no garlic, no onions, nothing with a strong, recognisable aroma that might suggest actual flavour. This isn't an accident. This is intentional. Because at royal courts, especially in France, England, and Italy during the Renaissance and beyond, eating garlic or onions was considered a sign of low breeding. It marked you as someone who worked with their hands, who lived in close quarters with animals, who couldn't afford to smell like flowers and rosewater. The logic was simple and classist. Peasants ate garlic and onions because those ingredients were cheap, filling, and grew easily. A field worker needed garlic to add flavour to their plain bread and stew. A farmer relied on onions to make their root vegetables palatable. These were survival foods for survival people. But you were nobility. You didn't need cheap flavour. You could afford exotic spices shipped from halfway across the world. You could pay for delicate sauces made with almonds, saffron and verjuice. You didn't eat like you were desperate. You ate like you were refined, and refinement apparently meant smelling like nothing at all. Here's the thing, garlic and onions are pungent. When you eat them, the sulfur compounds are absorbed into your bloodstream and eventually exhaled through your lungs and secreted through your skin. You don't just get garlic breath. You become garlic. Your entire body emits a faint but unmistakable aroma for hours, sometimes days. For peasants working in fields, this was irrelevant. Everyone smelled. Hygiene was a luxury. If you reeked of garlic, onions, sweat, and dirt, well, so did everyone else. Nobody noticed. But in a royal court where people bathed, occasionally, wore perfumes and surrounded themselves with scented pomanders and herbs, smelling like garlic was a disaster. It announced that you'd eaten common food, that you'd made a common choice, that you were, perhaps, common yourself. So garlic and onions were banned from refined cuisine. Not officially, there were no royal decrees declaring thou shalt not eat garlic, but socially the message was clear. If you showed up at court smelling like garlic, you'd be mocked, avoided, and quietly uninvited from future events. Etiquette manuals are full of warnings about this. A 16th century Italian guide advises, do not eat garlic or onions before attending gatherings, lest your breath offend those of gentle birth. A French manual from the 1600s is even more direct. Garlic is the food of labourers, and should be avoided by anyone who values their reputation. The Spanish were particularly intense about this. In Spain, garlic was associated with Moors and Jews, groups that the Catholic monarchy was actively persecuting and expelling. Eating garlic could make people question your religious loyalties. Were you secretly Jewish? Were you sympathetic to Islamic culture? No? Then why do you smell like garlic? It became a test of identity. If you avoided garlic, you signalled that you were a good Christian, a loyal subject, and definitely not someone who needed to be investigated by the Inquisition. If you ate garlic anyway, you were either brave, stupid, or actually part of a marginalised group trying to hold on to your culinary traditions in a hostile environment. But garlic wasn't the only culprit. Onions were almost as bad. Leeks, shallots, chives, anything in the allium family was suspect. Even cabbage and turnips were considered questionable because they could make you gassy, and being gassy at court was a one-way ticket to social exile. This created a problem for chefs, because garlic and onions are foundational ingredients. They're the base of almost every savoury dish in European cuisine. Removing them meant rebuilding flavour profiles from scratch, so chefs got creative. They used enormous quantities of expensive spices to compensate. Dishes were loaded with pepper, ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg and cardamom. Food became aggressively spiced, almost to the point of being inedible, just to avoid using the cheap, effective, flavourful ingredients that actually worked. Some chefs tried to sneak garlic and onions in anyway. They'd cook them so thoroughly that the smell dissipated, or they'd use tiny amounts, hoping nobody would notice. But nobles had keen noses, or at least they pretended to, and could detect even a hint of garlic. If a dish smelled suspicious, it would be sent back to the kitchen, and the chef would be reprimanded. There are records of chefs being fired for using garlic. Fired. For seasoning food properly. Because their employer's reputation mattered more than flavour. And it wasn't just about what you ate at court. The ban extended to your entire diet. If you ate garlic for breakfast at home, then showed up to the palace in the afternoon, people could still smell it. Your pores were betraying you. Your breath was a time-release capsule of shame. So nobles who wanted to attend court events had to plan their meals days in advance. No garlic on Monday if you had a banquet on Tuesday. No onions on Wednesday if you were meeting the king on Thursday. You became a prisoner of your own potential odour. Some people turned to remedies. They'd chew on parsley, mint or fennel seeds to mask garlic breath. They'd rinse their mouths with wine or vinegar. They'd eat apples or anise, hoping the sweetness would cover the smell. None of this worked particularly well. Garlic doesn't hide. Garlic announces itself. Others just gave up on garlic entirely. They stopped eating it, stopped cooking with it, stopped thinking about it. They internalized the idea that garlic was peasant food beneath them, unworthy of their refined palates. Over generations, entire noble families forgot what garlic tasted like. Meanwhile, peasants kept eating it, and thriving. Because garlic is genuinely good for you. It has antibacterial and antiviral properties. It boosts the immune system. It helps with circulation. During plague outbreaks, people who ate garlic regularly had better survival rates than those who didn't. But nobles didn't know this. Or if they did, they didn't care. Health was less important than status. Better to die elegant and garlic-free than to survive smelling like a field worker. And the irony is that some of the most powerful people in Europe were secretly eating garlic. Kings, queens, and aristocrats would indulge in garlic-heavy dishes in private, behind closed doors where nobody could judge them. They'd have their servants prepare garlicky stews and roasted meats, then eat alone, enjoying the forbidden flavour. But in public, never. In public, they performed refinement. They ate bland, overspiced food and pretended it was superior. This hypocrisy extended to other common foods too. Beans, for example. Beans were peasant food. They caused flatulence, which was unacceptable, so nobles avoided them, even though beans were cheap, nutritious and filling. Cabbage was similarly stigmatised. It smelled when cooked. It made you gassy. It was what poor people ate when they couldn't afford meat. Therefore it was beneath the nobility. Even certain fish were considered low class because of their smell. Salted herring, for instance, an affordable preserved fish that fed millions, was mocked at court as beggar's protein. Never mind that salted herring was delicious and practical. It smelled, and smell was the enemy. The wealthy ate delicate fish like pike or trout, prepared with minimal seasoning and no garlic, ensuring that the meal was both expensive and nearly flavourless. But at least they smelled like nothing afterward. Now imagine you're a noble who genuinely loves garlic. Maybe you grew up eating it before your family gained status. Maybe you travelled and developed a taste for Mediterranean cuisine. You know garlic makes food better. You crave it, but you can't have it. Not if you want to maintain your position. Not if you want invitations to continue arriving. So you suffer through bland meals, dreaming of a garlic, knowing that your social survival depends on smelling like a bouquet of absolutely nothing. Some nobles rebelled quietly. They'd eat garlic on their country estates, away from court, where the rules were more relaxed. Out in the countryside, away from prying noses and judgmental courtiers, they could indulge. But the moment they returned to the capital, the garlic ban resumed. And then there were the outsiders, foreign diplomats, visiting merchants, travellers from regions where garlic was normal. They'd show up at court, reeking of last night's dinner, completely unaware that they'd just committed a social crime. The reactions were brutal. Nobles would wrinkle their noses, cover their faces with perfumed handkerchiefs, and whisper to each other, "Can you believe it? He smells like a stable worker." The outsider, confused and embarrassed, would eventually learn the rule, and they'd either conform or stop being invited. But here's what really gets me. This wasn't about health or hygiene. It was purely about class signalling. Garlic didn't make you dirty. It didn't make you sick. It just made you smell like someone who ate garlic. And that was enough to disqualify you from polite society. It's the same logic that made pale skin desirable because it meant you didn't work outdoors, or soft hands valuable because they meant you didn't do manual labour. Everything about your body, how you looked, how you smelled, how you moved, was a broadcast of your social status. And nobles guarded that status obsessively. They couldn't control their bloodlines easily, they couldn't always control their wealth, but they could control what they ate and how they smelled. So they did, aggressively. By the 18th and 19th centuries, this started to change. As the middle class grew and social mobility increased, food snobbery became harder to enforce. People of all classes began eating similar things. Garlic crept back into fashionable cuisine, rebranded as rustic or authentic. But the stigma lingered. Even today there's a faint echo of that old prejudice. People pop breath mints after eating garlic. They apologise for ordering the garlic bread. They worry about smelling off in professional settings. We've inherited the anxiety without the context. We don't consciously think garlic is peasant food. But somewhere deep in our cultural memory, the idea persists that smelling strongly of food is inappropriate, unprofessional, a little embarrassing. So the next time you eat garlic and worry about your breath, remember, you're experiencing a social rule that was invented centuries ago by people who thought smelling like a human being was vulgar, and then eat more garlic. Because it's delicious, it's good for you, and the nobles who avoided it are long dead anyway. Medieval and Renaissance banquets loved spectacle, and nothing said, "We have too much money and time," like a surprise pie. These weren't normal pies. They were massive, elaborate pastry constructions designed to impress and confuse. The crust was often inedible, serving only as a shell for whatever theatrical nonsense was about to happen. You're at the banquet. You've made it through 15 courses. Your stomach is staging a protest. Your corset is cutting off circulation to your lower body. And then the servants wheel out something enormous covered with a cloth. Everyone at the table perks up. This is it. The entertainment portion of the meal, they remove the cloth. Beneath it sits a pie, but not just any pie. This thing is the size of a bathtub. The crust is golden, elaborately decorated with pastry flowers, leaves, and possibly a coat of arms. It's been glazed to a shine. It looks more like a piece of furniture than food, and everyone's staring at it, waiting. A servant approaches with a large knife. The room goes quiet. He cuts into the crust, and then chaos. Birds explode out of the pie. Live birds. Dozens of them. They burst into the air, flapping wildly, screeching, crashing into tapestries, dive-bombing nobles, pooping on the table. It's pandemonium. People are screaming. Someone's trying to catch a pigeon with their napkin. A finch lands in the butter dish. This is fine dining. This was a real thing. It happened regularly. It even inspired the nursery rhyme, "Sing a song of sixpence," 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Except they weren't baked. They were placed inside a pre-baked hollow crust and released when the pie was cut. The birds were usually unharmed, just very confused and extremely angry. Why would anyone do this? Because it was impressive. Because it was unexpected. Because when you're hosting a banquet for 200 people, and you need to prove you're wealthier and more creative than the last person who hosted a banquet, you put birds in a pie. But birds weren't the only surprise. Some pies contained live frogs. Imagine that. You're sitting there, minding your own business, and suddenly there are frogs hopping across the table, landing in wine goblets, leaping into laps. One Italian banquet in the 1500s featured a pie that released rabbits, live rabbits, running loose in a formal dining hall. Servants spent the next hour trying to recapture them while nobles laughed and pretended this was normal. Other pies contained people. Yes, people. Specifically, small people, dwarfs and children, who would be hidden inside the pie, waiting for their cue. When the pie was cut, they'd pop out, sometimes singing, sometimes reciting poetry, sometimes just standing there looking confused while everyone applauded. One famous example. At a banquet thrown by the Duke of Burgundy in 1454, a giant pie was brought out, and when it was opened, a full musical ensemble emerged, musicians with instruments, playing a song from inside a pie. It was dinner theatre, literally. These weren't meant to be eaten, by the way. The surprise pies were purely decorative and performative. The crust was usually made with lard and flour, baked rock hard to hold its shape and completely inedible. After the surprise was revealed, the pie shell would be removed and actual food would be served. But the spectacle was the point, and it wasn't just pies. There were surprise roasts, birds or animals that, when carved, revealed something unexpected inside. A roasted peacock might contain a roasted chicken, which contained a roasted quail, which contained more surprises. It was like Russian nesting dolls, except made of poultry and increasingly baffling. One particularly ambitious chef created a roasted boar with a roasted lamb inside it, with a roasted goose inside that, with a roasted duck inside that. When it was carved open at the table, each layer was revealed with theatrical flair. Guests gasped and applauded. Meanwhile, the actual carving took so long that the outer layers were cold by the time anyone could eat them. But the peak of surprise food absurdity was the subtlety. These were elaborate sugar and pastry sculptures, sometimes several feet tall, designed to look like castles, ships, mythological scenes, or famous battles. They were brought out between courses, displayed for everyone to admire, and sometimes even motorized or rigged with simple mechanisms to move. At one English banquet, a subtlety depicted an entire naval battle, complete with ships that appeared to fire tiny sugar cannons. At another, a castle made of marzipan was attacked by mechanical knights on horseback. Guests watched in awe as sugar soldiers laid siege to a pastry fortress, all while trying to digest 16 courses of actual food. These sculptures were edible, technically. They were made from sugar paste, marzipan, and pastry, but they were also works of art that had taken weeks to create. Eating them felt wrong, like vandalizing a museum, so most guests didn't. They admired the subtlety, applauded the craftsmanship, and let it sit there until the servants cleared it away. Some wealthy hosts commissioned subtleties that told stories. A series of sugar sculptures would be brought out one by one, each depicting a scene from classical mythology or biblical history. It was like a multi-course visual novel, except everyone was too full to pay attention and just wanted the spectacle to end so they could go home. But the real purpose of all this, the pies, the sculptures, the elaborate presentations, was to create something people would talk about. Because in royal and noble circles, your reputation depended on throwing memorable events. If your banquet was boring, if it was just food without theatre, people would forget it immediately. But if you put 24 blackbirds in a pie, if you unveiled a 5-foot-tall sugar castle that moved, if you served a roasted peacock redressed in its own feathers with flames shooting from its beak, people remembered that. They told stories. They spread the word. Your name became associated with extravagance and creativity, and the next host would try to top you. It became an arms race of absurdity. Each banquet had to be more elaborate, more surprising, more ridiculous than the last, which is how we ended up with pies full of live animals and mechanical knights attacking marzipan fortresses. But let's talk about the logistics. Creating a pie large enough to hold live birds required engineering. The crust had to be strong enough to support its own weight, but hollow enough to contain the birds. There had to be air holes so the birds didn't suffocate, and the birds had to be kept calm, usually by keeping them in darkness, until the moment of reveal. Coordinating this took a team. Bakers, engineers, bird handlers, and servants all had to work together. And if anything went wrong, if the pie collapsed, if the birds escaped early, if someone sneezed and startled them, the whole spectacle was ruined. There are records of disaster pies. One banquet in France featured a pie that was supposed to release doves, but the birds had died inside the crust before the reveal. When the pie was cut, dead birds tumbled out onto the table. The guests were horrified. The host was mortified. That banquet was remembered, but not in the way anyone wanted. Another disaster. A pie designed to release a small acrobat. The acrobat was supposed to leap out, do a flip, and land gracefully. Instead, he got stuck. His legs were cramping from being folded inside the pie for too long. He emerged slowly, awkwardly, like a confused turtle, and immediately fell over. Guests didn't know whether to laugh or help. They settled for polite applause. And then there was the issue of what to do with the animals after the surprise. If you released 24 birds into a banquet hall, you now had 24 birds flying around, panicking and making a mess. Servants would spend the rest of the evening trying to catch them, armed with nets and brooms, while the banquet continued below. Some birds were never caught. They'd escape into the rafters, make nests and live in the palace permanently. There are accounts of nobles complaining about the pie birds weeks after a banquet, as finches and sparrows chirped from the ceiling during important meetings. But despite the logistical nightmares and occasional disasters, surprise pies remained popular for centuries. They evolved with technology. In the 1700s, some pies were rigged with fireworks that would sparkle and fizz when the pie was opened. Health and safety? Never heard of her. By the Victorian era, surprise pies had mostly fallen out of fashion, replaced by other forms of dinner entertainment. But the concept survived. Even today, we have gender reveal cakes that release coloured smoke or confetti. We have desserts with hidden layers and surprise fillings. We've just scaled back on the live animals, but the spirit remains the same. Food isn't just food. It's performance. It's spectacle. It's a way to impress people and create memories. And if that means hiding birds in pastry or constructing a mechanical sugar castle, so be it. So there you sit, at your Renaissance banquet, covered in feathers, watching a finch land in the soup tureen, wondering how your life led to this moment. The host is beaming, proud of their surprise pie. The guests are applauding, some genuinely delighted, others just relieved it wasn't frogs this time. And somewhere, in the kitchen, a chef is already planning the next banquet. Something bigger, something bolder, something that will make people talk for years. Maybe a pie with a small orchestra inside. Maybe a roasted swan that shoots fireworks from its beak. Maybe a marzipan dragon that actually breathes sugar smoke. Because in the world of royal dining, food was never just food, it was theatre. and the show had to go on no matter how many birds ended up in the chandelier. This one's particularly cruel. In many royal courts, showing too much enthusiasm for your meal was considered vulgar. You weren't supposed to moan, smile too widely, or heaven forbid, lick your fingers. Eating was meant to be a refined, emotionless activity. You were basically required to consume a 12-course feast while maintaining the facial expression of someone doing their taxes. You're seated at the banquet table. Finally, after all the waiting, the posturing, and the bird-filled pies, you're actually eating. And the food, when it's not bland or fishy or theatrical, is actually good. There's a perfectly roasted piece of venison on your plate. It's tender. It's flavourful. It's probably the best thing you've eaten all month. Your natural human reaction would be to close your eyes, savour it, maybe let out a small satisfied sigh, maybe even smile, but you can't. Because showing pleasure while eating is vulgar. It suggests you're too focused on physical gratification, like some kind of hedonist who cares more about earthly pleasures than spiritual refinement. So you chew. Mechanically, your face blank, your expression neutral. You're experiencing deliciousness while looking like you're reviewing a legal document. It's gastronomic dissociation, and it's mandatory. The rules were explicit. Etiquette manuals from the Renaissance and Baroque periods are filled with warnings about excessive food enthusiasm. One French guide states, "Do not make noises of pleasure when eating, as this suggests gluttony." Another Italian manual advises, "Keep your countenance composed. To show delight in food is to reveal a weakness of character for enjoying dinner." The logic went something like this. Refined people were supposed to be above base pleasures. Yes, they needed to eat, unfortunate biological requirement, but they weren't supposed to enjoy it too much. Eating was fuel, a social obligation, a display of wealth and status. It wasn't supposed to bring you actual joy. Peasants enjoyed their food. They smiled and laughed and made appreciative noises because they were simple folk who lived for simple pleasures. But you were nobility. You had transcended such vulgarities. You consumed your roasted peacock with the emotional engagement of someone filling out a census form. Let's break down the specific forbidden behaviours, because the list was extensive and deeply stupid. First, moaning or sighing. This was the worst offence. If food was so good that you involuntarily made a sound of pleasure, you just revealed yourself as someone ruled by appetite. Gluttonous, uncontrolled, possibly dangerous. Because if you couldn't control your reaction to food, what else couldn't you control? There are actual accounts of people being mocked for this. At one French court dinner in the 1600s, a visiting German noble apparently groaned with pleasure after tasting a particularly good pie. The French courtiers immediately started whispering. By the next day, he was known as the Moaning German, and his diplomatic mission was essentially over. His reputation never recovered. Second, smiling too widely. You could smile. A small, polite, restrained smile was acceptable. The kind of smile you'd give when someone shows you a painting you don't like, but you want to be polite. Tight-lipped. Minimal. Barely visible. But a genuine smile. Showing teeth. Looking actually happy. That was excessive. It suggested you were experiencing too much pleasure. That food mattered too much to you. That you weren't refined enough to maintain composure. Some nobles trained themselves to eat without changing their facial expressions at all. They'd practice at home, eating alone, forcing themselves to stay neutral no matter how good or bad the food was. It was like emotional poker, except the stakes were your social reputation and the cards were roasted duck. Third, licking your fingers. This is the one that gets me. Because licking your fingers is a natural, practical response to eating food with your hands. Sauce gets on your fingers, grease accumulates, and your tongue is right there, perfectly designed to clean them. But no, licking your fingers was barbaric. It was something animals did. Dogs licked. Cats licked. You were a human being of noble birth and you kept your tongue inside your mouth where it belonged. If your fingers got dirty, and they would, because remember, you're eating with utensils that barely work, you were supposed to dab them delicately on your napkin. Not wipe, dab, like you're gently touching a wound, not cleaning grease off your hands. And you definitely couldn't suck sauce off your fingers. That was so beyond the pale that etiquette manuals didn't even mention it directly. They'd just say things like, "Never bring your fingers to your mouth in a manner suggesting hunger or base satisfaction," which is code for, don't suck your fingers like you're trying to extract the last drops of flavour from life itself. Fourth, leaning forward eagerly. Your posture had to remain upright, dignified and distant. You couldn't lean over your plate like you were investigating a crime scene. You couldn't hunch forward with anticipation. You sat straight, shoulders back, as if the food in front of you was mildly interesting at best. Even reaching for food had rules. You extended your arm gracefully without urgency. You didn't lunge. You didn't grab. You certainly didn't reach across someone else to get to the good stuff. Every movement was measured, controlled, and completely devoid of genuine human desire. Fifth, eating too quickly. This was interpreted as desperation. If you shoveled food into your mouth, if you barely chewed before swallowing, if you cleaned your plate in under 5 minutes, you looked hungry. And looking hungry suggested you were poor, or poorly fed, or not wealthy enough to eat like this regularly. So even if you were starving, even if you'd skipped breakfast and lunch to save room for this banquet, you had to eat slowly, deliberately, taking small bites, pausing between mouthfuls, pretending you could take it or leave it. Some nobles would eat a huge meal before attending a banquet, just so they wouldn't be tempted to eat too eagerly at the actual event. They'd arrive already full, pick at their food for show, and maintain perfect composure because they genuinely weren't hungry. It was strategic emotional management through preemptive carb loading. Sixth, complimenting the food too enthusiastically. You could offer a polite, measured compliment. "The venison is quite well prepared," or "this sauce is adequate." Restrained praise that suggested you'd eaten better elsewhere, but this was acceptable. But if you gushed, if you said something like, "This is the most incredible thing I've ever tasted," you'd just revealed that you hadn't eaten enough incredible things, that your palate was unsophisticated, that you were easily impressed. Experienced courtiers learned to damn with faint praise. Interesting choice of seasoning could mean it was either brilliant or terrible. And you'd never know which. Certainly bold was a nice way of saying, "This is weird and I don't like it, but I'm not going to admit that directly." Seventh, looking at your food too intently. You were supposed to glance at it briefly, acknowledge its existence, then look away. Staring at your food suggested obsession. Examining it too closely suggested suspicion. Were you checking for poison? Or worse, were you so fascinated by the presentation that you'd never seen food this fancy before? The ideal noble ate while looking slightly bored, as if this 12-course feast was just another Tuesday. Their gaze would drift around the room, landing on tapestries, other guests, the ceiling, anywhere but the plate in front of them. And yet somehow they had to navigate eating complicated foods with bones, shells, and intricate preparations, without actually looking at them. It was like performing surgery while staring at the wall. Impressive, but unnecessarily difficult. Eighth, making eye contact with the food servers. This was more about class hierarchy than food enjoyment, but it relates. You didn't acknowledge the servants bringing you food. You didn't thank them. You didn't smile at them. They were invisible. Furniture that happened to move. Showing appreciation to a servant suggested you saw them as people, which implied you weren't comfortable with your superior status. It made you seem soft, overly familiar, possibly middle class. True nobility didn't notice servants any more than they'd notice the candlesticks, so food would appear on your plate delivered by invisible hands, and you'd consume it with the emotional investment of someone watching paint dry. Peak refinement. The cruelty of all this is that these banquets featured genuinely impressive food. Talented chefs spent days preparing elaborate dishes. Rare ingredients were sourced from across the world. Enormous budgets were dedicated to creating memorable meals, and you had to sit there, tasting all of it, while pretending you didn't care. It's like being given front row tickets to your favourite band and being told you're not allowed to react. You can watch, you can listen, but you have to sit perfectly still with a neutral expression, showing no enthusiasm, no emotion, no sign that you're experiencing anything at all. Some people cracked. There are accounts of nobles who simply couldn't maintain the facade. They'd smile too widely, laugh at a flavour combination, or make an involuntary sound of pleasure, and they'd be quietly, ruthlessly judged for it. Others turned into emotional robots. They trained themselves so thoroughly that they genuinely stopped experiencing pleasure from food. Eating became mechanical. They'd consume elaborate meals while feeling nothing, their capacity for joy slowly eroded by years of forced restraint. And here's the darkest part. This emotional suppression extended beyond food. If you couldn't show enthusiasm for dinner, you probably couldn't show enthusiasm for anything. Joy became suspicious. Delight became vulgar. Genuine emotion became a liability. Royal courts became populated by people who'd learned to feel less, want less, express less. They moved through banquets and life with careful, measured responses to everything. Always controlled, always composed, always performing refinement at the expense of actually living. So there you are, at your 12th course, eating something that's objectively delicious. Your taste buds are celebrating. Your brain is releasing happy chemicals. Your body is experiencing pleasure, and your face shows nothing. You chew methodically. You swallow precisely. You dab your lips with your hierarchical napkin. You maintain your posture. You do not smile, moan, sigh, or lick anything. You are refined. You are controlled. You are perfectly miserably proper. And somewhere deep inside, the part of you that used to enjoy things dies just a little bit more. Welcome to noble dining, where the food is incredible and you're absolutely not allowed to care. Before plates became standard, many medieval diners used thick slices of stale bread called trenchers as edible plates. You'd pile your food on top, let the bread soak up the juices, and then, theoretically, eat the trencher at the end of the meal. For nobles, this was just the beginning of their bread-based social anxiety. You're seated at a medieval banquet sometime in the 13th or 14th century, before fancy ceramic plates became common. In front of you sits a thick slab of stale bread, about 4 days old, cut into a rough square. This is your plate. It's also potentially your meal, or maybe not. The rules are complicated and depend entirely on who you are and where you're sitting. The concept was simple. Bread was abundant, sturdy when stale, and could absorb liquids without falling apart immediately. So instead of washing expensive wooden or metal plates after every meal, you just used bread. Pile your meat, vegetables and sauces on top. Let the bread soak up the juices. At the end, you had a gravy-soaked piece of bread that was technically edible. For peasants and lower-class workers, this was perfect. The trencher was part of the meal. You'd eat your roasted chicken or stewed vegetables, then finish with the soggy, flavour-saturated bread underneath. Nothing was wasted. You got your protein, your vegetables and your carbs all in one efficient system. But for nobles, the trencher became a minefield of etiquette and social signalling. First question, do you eat it? The answer depended on context, company and your exact social rank. Some courts considered eating your trencher to be vulgar and lower class. It suggested you were hungry enough to eat your own plate, which implied you weren't wealthy enough to be properly fed. Other courts expected you to eat it, but only after everyone else had finished, and only if you did so delicately without drawing attention. You couldn't just pick up the soggy bread and bite into it like a sandwich. You had to break off small, dignified pieces with your knife and eat them slowly, as if you were doing this out of politeness to the bread, not because you actually wanted it. And some courts had a third option. You didn't eat the trencher at all. Instead, it was collected after the meal and given to the poor. This was seen as an act of charity. You'd consumed the good parts of your meal, and the bread, now soaked with meat juices and sauce, went to people waiting outside the castle or manor. They'd be genuinely grateful for it. It was often the best food they'd get all week. So before you touched your trencher, you had to read the room. What are other people doing? Is anyone eating theirs? Are servants collecting them? Is the host watching? Make the wrong choice and you've just broadcast your ignorance to the entire table. But let's talk about the practical problems with trenchers, because there were many. First, they got soggy fast. You'd place a nice piece of roasted meat on your trencher, and within minutes the bread would start absorbing the juices. This was the point, yes, but it also meant your plate was actively disintegrating while you ate. If you weren't careful, if you piled too much food on one spot, or if your meat was particularly juicy, the trencher would break apart. Suddenly, you'd have a structural failure. Your bread plate would split down the middle, dumping your dinner onto the table. Sauce would pool on the tablecloth. Vegetables would roll away. You'd just created a mess, and everyone saw it happen. This was mortifying. It suggested you didn't understand portion control or bread physics. Servants would rush over to clean up, which drew even more attention. Other guests would politely look away, but they'd remember. You were now the person who broke their trencher at the Earl's dinner. Second, trenchers were uneven. They weren't manufactured. They were just thick slices of bread, cut by hand, often from loaves that weren't uniformly shaped. So your trencher might be thicker on one side, creating a slope. Your food would slide. Peas would roll off like tiny green marbles. Sauce would pool in one corner. You'd spend half the meal trying to prevent your dinner from escaping, using your knife to push food back toward the centre, building little bread walls to contain the gravy. It was less like eating, and more like playing a very stressful board game. Third, trenchers didn't stay in place. Unlike modern plates which sit flat and stable, trenchers were just bread sitting on a wooden table. If you cut your meat too aggressively, the whole trencher could shift. If someone bumped the table, your trencher might slide. Some diners tried to stabilise their trenchers by pressing down on the edges, but that risked breaking the bread. Others just accepted the instability and ate very, very carefully, making tiny cuts and moving slowly to avoid disaster. Fourth, trenchers attracted attention from below. If you were eating at a great hall with dogs wandering around, and there were always dogs, they could smell your trencher. A gravy-soaked piece of bread sitting at knee level was basically a dog magnet. You'd be mid-bite, and suddenly you'd feel a wet nose against your leg. A dog's head would appear under the table, eyes locked on your trencher, tail wagging with hope. If you weren't paying attention, the dog might just grab your entire bread plate and run. This was common enough that some etiquette manuals explicitly warned against it. Do not allow hounds to steal your trencher, as this reflects poorly on your vigilance. Yes, it was your fault if a dog stole your plate. You should have been more alert. Fifth, trenchers had different quality levels, and this was another hierarchy thing. The best trenchers were made from high-quality wheat bread, baked specifically to be sturdy. They were thick even, and could hold a lot of food without collapsing. The worst trenchers were made from cheap, coarse bread, rye or barley, that was already crumbling before you put anything on it. Guess which ones the nobles got and which ones everyone else got. If you were seated above the salt, your trencher was pristine white bread, almost cake-like in texture, designed to absorb sauce without falling apart. If you were below the salt, your trencher was dark, rough, and already sporting a few suspicious cracks. And you couldn't complain. You ate off the trencher you were given, and the quality of that bread told everyone exactly how important you were. Sixth, there was debate about whether you should eat from the top of your trencher or turn it over halfway through the meal. Some people used one side for the first course, then flipped it for the second course, maximising the bread's utility. Others thought flipping your trencher was low class, like you were trying to squeeze every possible use out of it, because you couldn't afford to waste anything. This created confusion. At some banquets, half the table was flipping their trenchers, and half wasn't. Nobody knew which was correct. People watched each other nervously, trying to follow the lead of higher-ranking guests, while also not looking like they were copying. Seventh, trenchers were sometimes shared. In less formal settings, or when dining with family, two people might share one large trencher. They'd both place their food on it, creating a communal eating surface. This required coordination. You had to make sure your food didn't touch the other person's food. You had to leave them space. You had to avoid the awkward moment where you both reached for your knives at the same time and your hands collided over the bread. Sharing a trencher was intimate. It meant you trusted the other person not to contaminate your food or hog all the good soaking spots. Marriages have been strengthened and ruined over trencher sharing etiquette. Eighth, when ceramic and metal plates started becoming more common in the 15th and 16th centuries, trenchers didn't disappear immediately. They hung around as a sort of old-fashioned option. Some conservative nobles insisted on using trenchers because plates were newfangled nonsense. But this created a new problem. Now you had to choose. Plate or trencher? And your choice was judged. Using a trencher made you seem traditional, rustic, possibly behind the times. Using a plate made you seem modern, but also possibly pretentious or wasteful. There was no winning. Whatever you chose, someone at the table would quietly judge you for it. And then there's the question of what happened to uneaten trenchers. As I mentioned, Many were collected and given to the poor. This was standard practice at large households and monasteries. Servants would gather the bread, place it in baskets, and distribute it at the gates. But this created a strange dynamic. The poor who received these trenchers were eating bread that had been sat on by noble plates. The bread was soaked with the meat juices and sauces from meals they'd never be able to afford themselves. It was charity, yes, but it was also a very physical reminder of the class divide. Some recipients were grateful. Others must have felt the indignity of eating someone else's used bread plate. But hunger tends to override pride, so they ate it anyway. For nobles who knew their trenchers would be given away, this added another layer of anxiety. You had to make sure you didn't make your trencher too disgusting. If it was falling apart, or if you'd let it get too soggy, you were essentially sending garbage to the poor, which didn't make you look charitable. It made you look careless. So you'd eat carefully, trying to preserve your trencher's integrity, knowing that hours from now someone hungry would be eating what you left behind. And finally, the slow death of the trencher tells us something about how dining evolved. As plates became affordable and common, the trencher disappeared. By the 1600s, it was mostly gone from noble tables, relegated to folklore and history. But for centuries, it was the standard. Millions of people ate their meals off bread, navigated the soggy structural failures, decided whether to eat their plates, and either wasted or shared or donated their edible dishware. So there you sit, medieval noble, staring at your trencher. It's loaded with food. It's starting to sag. A dog is circling under the table. You're not sure if you're supposed to eat this bread or give it away. The person next to you just flipped theirs, but the person across from you definitely didn't. You take a careful bite of venison, trying not to think about the bread slowly dissolving beneath it, and you wonder, not for the first time, why eating has to be this complicated. Because it's not just a meal, it's a test, and the plate is also the exam paper, and also maybe your lunch, depending on who's watching. At formal royal banquets, you didn't just grab your goblet and start drinking whenever you felt like it. Oh no. You had to wait for the official toasts, and these weren't quick. There were toasts to the king, to the queen, to visiting dignitaries, to the hunting dogs, to the concept of good weather. It went on forever. You're at the banquet. Your throat is dry. You've been eating salty meat for the past hour. Your mouth feels like it's been lined with wool. And right there, inches from your hand, sits a beautiful goblet filled with wine. Red, glistening, perfectly poured. All you have to do is reach for it. But you can't, because no one has made a toast yet. And drinking before the toast is not just rude. It's a social crime that marks you as uncivilized, impatient, and possibly raised by wolves. So you sit. You wait. You stare at that goblet like it's the Holy Grail, which, given your level of thirst, it basically is. And you pray that someone important will stand up soon and say literally anything that allows you to drink. The toasting ritual at royal banquets was sacred. It had structure, hierarchy, and ironclad rules. The king or host would rise first. Always first. He'd lift his goblet, wait for silence, and then deliver a toast. Maybe to God, maybe to the kingdom, maybe to the health of everyone present. The actual content didn't matter. What mattered was that he did it first. Everyone would rise, chairs scraping, fabric rustling, and lift their goblets in unison. The king would drink. Everyone would drink. And then, finally, after what felt like hours, you'd get your first sip of wine. But that was just the beginning. Because once the king had made his toast, other people could make theirs. And they did, endlessly. The queen would toast. High-ranking nobles would toast. Visiting ambassadors would toast. Military commanders would toast. Bishops would toast. Sometimes the host would toast again, just to be thorough. Each toast required the same ritual. Everyone stands, everyone lifts their goblet, everyone waits for the toaster to finish speaking, everyone drinks. And the speeches? Oh, they could be long. Some nobles saw toasts as an opportunity to demonstrate their eloquence, their wit, their knowledge of classical rhetoric. They'd ramble, they'd quote Latin, they'd tell stories that went nowhere. They'd make obscure references that nobody understood. You'd be standing there, goblet raised, arm getting tired, listening to Lord So-and-so drone on about the symbolic importance of the harvest, while your wine slowly warmed in your hand, and you couldn't sit down, you couldn't drink early. You had to wait until he finished and gave the signal. If someone made a particularly long toast, and some lasted 10 minutes or more. People would start swaying slightly, their arms trembling from holding the goblets aloft. The wine would slosh, some would spill, but you didn't lower your arm. That would be disrespectful. And here's where it gets truly absurd. Some banquets had mandatory toasts. The list was predetermined. You knew going in that there would be a toast to the king, the queen, the royal children, the visiting dignitaries, the success of recent military campaigns, the health of allied nations, the memory of the deceased, and possibly the king's favourite horse. That's a minimum of 8 toasts before anyone could drink freely. And each one required standing, waiting, and performing synchronized drinking like some kind of alcoholic choir. For people who were genuinely thirsty, this was torture. You'd be desperately dehydrated, choking down dry bread and salty meat, staring at your wine while some duke made his 4th toast of the evening to the enduring spirit of our noble ancestors. Some guests tried to cheat. They'd take tiny sips during the toasts, hoping nobody would notice. But people noticed. Servants noticed. Other guests noticed. And you'd be quietly labelled as someone who couldn't follow basic protocol. The wine thief. The impatient drinker. Not a good look. Others tried to sneak drinks of water between toasts, but even that was tricky. Water wasn't always on the table. And if it was, drinking it instead of wine during a formal banquet suggested you were either sick, suspicious of poison, or, worst of all, not wealthy enough to appreciate good wine. So you couldn't win. And let's talk about what happened if you accidentally drank before the toast. Maybe you were distracted. Maybe you forgot. Maybe you were so thirsty you acted on instinct. You reached for your goblet, brought it to your lips, and took a sip. The table went silent. People turned to look. You froze, wine still in your mouth, realizing your mistake. You just committed a faux pas in front of dozens of witnesses. The severity of the reaction depended on the court. In some places, people would pretend they didn't see it, allowing you to quietly die of embarrassment without making it worse. In other courts, someone might make a pointed comment. How eager Lord whoever is to drink. Perhaps he's unaccustomed to fine wine. And in the strictest courts, you'd be asked to leave, actually escorted out. Your breach of etiquette was so offensive that your presence was no longer welcome. You'd slink away, humiliated, knowing that tomorrow everyone would be talking about the person who drank before the toast. But the toast ritual wasn't just about control. It was also political. The order of toasts mattered. Who got toasted first, second, third? It all signalled importance and favour. If you were a visiting dignitary and the host toasted you early, that meant you were valued. If your toast came late, after the dogs and the weather, that was a message. You don't matter much. People paid attention to this. Diplomats would report back to their home countries about where they ranked in the toast order. I was toasted 5th, after the Queen's cousin but before the bishop. This suggests we are in moderate favour. International relations were being conducted through wine and speeches, and God forbid someone was skipped entirely. If you were a noble expecting a toast and you didn't get one, that was a public snub. It meant the host was displeased with you, or had forgotten you existed, which was almost worse. You'd sit there waiting as toast after toast was made to other people, realising you'd been deliberately excluded. Some nobles would leave early rather than sit through an entire banquet without being toasted. It was too humiliating. Better to make an excuse and exit than to endure the public declaration of your irrelevance. Now, let's talk about the drinking itself. When you finally got to drink, you didn't just gulp it down. Even during the toast, there were rules. You took a measured sip, not too much, not too little. You didn't drain your goblet in one go like you were at a tavern. You drank with dignity, restraint, and the appearance of not being desperately thirsty. And you had to make eye contact with the person being toasted, if possible. This was especially important if the king was being toasted. You'd look at him, raise your goblet slightly, nod respectfully, and drink. It was acknowledgement, loyalty, and theatre all at once. But maintaining eye contact while drinking from a heavy metal goblet, without spilling on yourself, required coordination. You'd tilt the goblet, keep your eyes up, sip carefully, and hope you didn't dribble wine down your chin in front of the entire court. Some people couldn't manage it. They'd try to drink and look at the king simultaneously, misjudge the angle, and end up with wine on their doublet. This was embarrassing but not catastrophic. as long as you handled it gracefully. You'd dab at the stain with your napkin, smile ruefully, and hope everyone forgot about it. The wine itself was another issue. At formal banquets, the wine was often spiced, sweetened, or watered down. This was partly for flavour, partly for tradition, and partly to prevent people from getting too drunk too quickly. But it also meant the wine didn't really quench your thirst the way you hoped. You'd take that long-awaited first sip, expecting relief, and instead get a mouthful of honeyed cinnamon-spiced liquid that was almost syrupy. It was wine, technically, but it tasted more like dessert, and it made you even thirstier. So you'd drink, feel momentarily satisfied, and then realise you needed more. But you couldn't just keep drinking. You had to wait for the next toast, and the next, and the next. By the middle of the banquet, some guests were visibly dehydrated. Their lips were dry. Their voices were hoarse. They'd been eating for hours, standing for toast repeatedly, and had only been allowed to drink in small ceremonial sips. Servants would occasionally refill goblets between toasts, but even that was strategic. If your goblet was refilled, it meant you were important enough to warrant attention. If it wasn't, you'd sit there with an empty goblet, unable to drink anyway because there was no toast, wondering if you'd been forgotten or snubbed. And here's a fun twist. Some banquets had penalty toasts. If you did something wrong, arrived late, made a social error, broke etiquette, the host could force you to drink a penalty toast. You'd have to stand alone while everyone watched and drink your entire goblet in one go as punishment. This was meant to be humiliating. You'd guzzle your wine, probably spill some, and sit down red-faced while everyone else smirked. But the joke was on them, because you'd just gotten to drink a full goblet of wine while they were still stuck in toast purgatory. Some clever nobles deliberately committed minor infractions just to earn penalty toasts. It was a loophole. Yes, you'd be embarrassed, but at least you'd be hydrated. By the end of a banquet, after dozens of toasts, people were exhausted. Not from the wine, though some were definitely drunk, but from the ritual. Standing, sitting, standing, sitting. Raising goblets, lowering goblets. Listening to speeches, pretending to care, drinking on command. And if you were unlucky enough to attend a banquet with a particularly enthusiastic host, the toasts might continue for hours. There are records of banquets where toasting lasted longer than the actual eating. People stood with their goblets raised for so long that their arms went numb. But you endured. Because this was fine dining. This was civilization. This was how refined people demonstrated their superiority over the unwashed masses who just drank when they were thirsty like animals. So there you sit, throat parched, goblet full, waiting for the 14th toast of the evening. This one's to the concept of good weather. Someone's standing, talking about how rain is necessary but sunshine is preferable, and how the kingdom benefits from temperate climates. You're not listening. You're staring at your wine, wondering how much longer this can possibly go on, and contemplating whether dying of thirst at a banquet would at least be a memorable way to go. And when the toast finally ends, when you're finally allowed to drink, you take the smallest, most dignified sip possible. Because you're refined. You're controlled, and you're absolutely, desperately counting down the minutes until you can leave this banquet, go home, and drink water like a normal human being. Certain fruits, especially imported ones, were subject to intense scrutiny before they could be served to royalty. We're not talking about a quick rinse. We're talking full inspections, servants examining each grape, each berry, each slice of melon for signs of rot, insects, or suspicious discoloration. You're in the royal kitchens. A shipment of grapes has just arrived from Italy. Expensive, exotic, purple, and supposedly delicious. They've travelled for weeks, carefully packed in wooden crates with straw, carried over mountains and across seas. They cost more than most servants earn in a month. And now, before a single grape can touch the king's lips, they must be inspected. Not by one person, by several. This is a team effort. A collaborative investigation into whether these grapes are worthy of the royal consumption. The head fruit inspector, yes, that was an actual position in some courts, oversees the operation. Under his supervision, junior servants begin the examination. Each grape is removed from the bunch, individually, one at a time. It's placed on a clean white cloth where it can be examined under candlelight. The servant looks for discoloration, soft spots, wrinkles, any indication that this grape has begun to ferment, rot, or otherwise decline from its perfect state. If the grape passes visual inspection, it moves to the touch test. The servant gently squeezes it, not hard enough to burst it, but firmly enough to assess its texture. Is it plump, firm, or is it mushy, suggesting internal breakdown? A mushy grape is removed. It goes into the reject pile. If the grape passes the touch test, it's inspected for insects. Tiny beetles love grapes, so do fruit flies, aphids, and various other creatures. The servant examines the surface, looking for holes, webbing, or the insects themselves. If anything suspicious is found, the grape is rejected. The entire bunch it came from might be rejected just to be safe. And if the grape passes all of that, it's given a final sniff test. Does it smell like a grape? Or does it smell off? Vinegary, mouldy, strange. Smell is a reliable indicator of spoilage. One weird-smelling grape can condemn an entire shipment. Only after passing all these tests does the grape earn the privilege of being placed in the bowl that will be presented to the king. And even then, it might be taste-tested first. A servant would pop one grape from the approved batch into their mouth, chew, swallow, and wait. If they didn't keel over or grimace, the grapes were cleared for royal consumption. This process could take hours for a single bowl of grapes. Now multiply that by every fruit at the banquet. Strawberries. Cherries, apples, pears, melons, figs. Each one required the same obsessive level of inspection. Servants would spend entire days examining fruit, rejecting most of it, and carefully arranging the approved specimens into aesthetically pleasing displays. Why? Because fruit was expensive, exotic, and symbolic. It represented wealth, international trade, and the ability to obtain luxury items from distant lands. But it was also fragile, perishable, and prone to harbouring rot and disease. Serving bad fruit to the king wasn't just embarrassing, it was potentially dangerous and definitely career-ending. There was also the poison paranoia. Fruit could be injected with toxins, an apple could be laced with arsenic, a fig could be stuffed with something deadly. So inspectors didn't just look for natural spoilage, they looked for tampering. Fruits were examined for puncture marks, tiny holes that might indicate someone had inserted a needle, unnatural discoloration that might suggest chemical contamination. Any fruit that looked even slightly suspicious was rejected and sometimes sent to be tested on animals. Yes, animals. Chickens or dogs would be fed the questionable fruit, and servants would wait to see if they died. This created a bizarre economy of rejected fruit. Massive quantities of perfectly good fruit, maybe a little bruised, maybe slightly overripe, but totally edible, were cast aside because they weren't perfect enough for royalty. What happened to all that rejected fruit? Sometimes it went to the servants. They'd eat the second-tier grapes, the apples with minor blemishes, the strawberries that were merely good instead of perfect. This was considered a perk of working in the royal kitchens. You got to eat like royalty, sort of, just with the reject pile. Other times, the rejected fruit was fed to animals. Pigs especially loved it. There are accounts of palace pigs eating better fruit than most peasants could ever dream of accessing, and occasionally rejected fruit was thrown away entirely, just discarded. Too much liability to give away, too imperfect to serve, so into the waste pile it went. This was the ultimate display of wealth. We have so much fruit that we can throw away the merely good stuff and only serve the absolutely perfect specimens. But let's talk about specific fruits and their inspection challenges, because some were worse than others. Grapes, as mentioned, were tedious. Hundreds of individual grapes per bunch, each requiring inspection. But at least they were relatively sturdy. Strawberries were a nightmare. They bruise if you look at them wrong. They mould quickly. They hide insects in their seeds and leaves. Inspecting strawberries meant examining each one with near microscopic attention, removing any with the slightest imperfection, and handling them so gently they didn't get damaged in the process. One servant dropping a tray of inspected strawberries meant starting over. Hours of work ruined. That servant would be reprimanded, possibly demoted, definitely not trusted with strawberries again. Melons presented a different problem. You couldn't see inside them until you cut them open. So inspectors would tap them, listening for the right sound, They'd smell the stem end, checking for sweetness. They'd examine the skin for soft spots or mould. But even a melon that passed all external tests could be rotten inside. So the solution? Cut open a sample melon from the same shipment. Examine its interior. If it was good, assume the others were too. If it was bad, reject the entire batch. This was wasteful but necessary. Better to discard 50 melons than to serve one bad slice to the king. Cherries had the pit problem. They looked fine from the outside, but could be rotten around the pit. Inspectors learned to spot subtle signs, slight wrinkling near the stem, unusual coloration, that suggested internal problems. But they couldn't cut open every cherry to check, so they sampled, extrapolated, and hoped. Figs were suspicious by nature. They're dark, soft, and easily hide insects. Fig wasps are a real thing. They crawl inside figs to pollinate them, and sometimes they die in there. So every fig was inspected for wasp holes, and many were rejected just on principle. Apples seemed straightforward, but they could harbour worms. A worm could burrow into an apple, eat the inside, and leave only a tiny entry hole. Inspectors would examine each apple's surface, looking for holes no bigger than a pinprick. If they found one, the apple was rejected and inspected further to see if the worm was still inside. If it was, the entire batch of apples was scrutinised more carefully. Pears were similar, but with the added challenge that they ripen unevenly. A pear could look perfect but be mealy inside, or it could look slightly bruised but be perfectly ripe. Inspectors had to use judgment, experience, and sometimes just luck. And citrus fruits, oranges, lemons, were relatively rare and incredibly expensive in Northern Europe. When they did appear, they were treated like precious gems. Each orange was examined, polished, and sometimes displayed before being served. The peel was checked for mould. The fruit was weighed. Too light might mean it had dried out inside. Some oranges were never eaten at all. They were too valuable. Instead, they were used as table decorations or given as gifts. You'd receive an orange from the king and be expected to treasure it, display it, and maybe eventually eat it weeks later when it had started to rot, and you couldn't justify keeping it any longer. The fruit inspection process also had a psychological component. It created jobs, hierarchy, and a sense of importance around food preparation. The head fruit inspector had status. He was responsible for the king's health and satisfaction. His judgment was trusted. His decisions were final. Junior servants aspired to become fruit inspectors. It was indoor work, relatively clean, and you got to handle luxury items. Plus, you could eat the rejects. It was a coveted position. But it also came with pressure. If you approved a bad grape and the king bit into it, you were blamed. If you rejected too much fruit and the king's table looked sparse, you were blamed. If fruit costs went up because you were too picky, you were blamed. You had to balance perfectionism with practicality, safety with spectacle, quality with quantity. It was essentially high-stakes fruit management. And the king had no idea how much effort went into that bowl of grapes. He'd pop one into his mouth, chew absently while discussing politics, and move on. He might not even finish them. He might eat 3 grapes and ignore the rest. Those 3 grapes represented hours of labour, intense scrutiny, and the anxious hope of multiple servants that they'd done their jobs correctly. There are records of kings complaining about fruit. These grapes are too sour. This apple is mealy. These strawberries aren't sweet enough. And the fruit inspector would panic, wondering if he'd made a mistake, if his job was in jeopardy, if he should have been more selective. Other times the king wouldn't comment at all. Silence. Which could mean the fruit was fine, or that he didn't care, or that he was planning to fire someone later. The uncertainty was constant. And all of this, the inspections, the rejections, the paranoia, the pressure, was for fruit. Not the main course, not the centerpiece of the meal, just the fruit course, a minor part of a multi-hour banquet. But fruit mattered because it was a status symbol. It showed you could afford imported luxuries. It demonstrated you had the resources to employ people whose only job was examining grapes. It proved you took quality seriously, that nothing substandard touched your table. So there you are, a royal fruit inspector, holding a grape up to the candlelight, Squinting at its surface, feeling for firmness, sniffing for signs of fermentation, you've examined 200 grapes today. You've rejected 150. Your back hurts. Your eyes are tired. Your fingers are sticky with grape juice. And you have 4 more crates to get through before tonight's banquet. But you keep going, because somewhere in the Great Hall the king will eat one of your grapes. Just one, and it had better be perfect. Because if it's not, you'll be the one getting inspected, and the results won't be favourable. In many royal households, carving meat wasn't just a task. It was an art form and a privilege. There were professional carvers whose entire job was to slice meat at the table with theatrical precision. And if you were dining with royalty, you absolutely could not carve your own meat. That would be like showing up to a Michelin star restaurant and asking to cook your own steak in the kitchen. You're at the banquet. A massive roasted peacock has just been placed on the table in front of you, redressed in its own feathers to look alive. It's beautiful, it's intimidating, and you have absolutely no idea how you're supposed to eat it because touching it yourself is completely forbidden. Enter the carver. He approaches the table with the gravity of a surgeon entering an operating room. He's dressed in fine livery, carries specialised knives, and has spent years, literally years, training for this moment. His job is to dismantle this bird with such grace and precision that it looks effortless, while you sit there trying not to drool. Carving was a legitimate profession in medieval and Renaissance courts. It wasn't something just anyone could do. You didn't hand a knife to the nearest servant and say, "Have at it." No, carving required skill, training, ceremony, and an intimate knowledge of anatomy, cuts, and presentation. The best carvers were respected members of the household. They had titles: Master Carver, Carver to the King, Chief Sewer, which meant server, not the underground pipe kind. They earned good wages. They had status. They stood at the high table during banquets, visible to everyone, performing their craft like artists. And they had rules. So many rules. There were entire books written about carving, manuals with detailed instructions on how to cut specific animals. The Boke of Curving, published in 1508, is basically a carving encyclopedia. It explains how to break a deer, wing a partridge, thigh a pigeon, and unlace a coney. That's a rabbit. Each animal had its own terminology. You didn't just cut things. You performed specific actions with specific names. You lifted a swan. You dismembered a peacock. You spoiled a hen. You embraced a mallard. Why? Because regular cutting was for peasants. Refined carving required refined vocabulary. The carver would approach the bird or roast with his knives, and he had several, each designed for different cuts. There was a knife for slicing, another for jointing, another for delicate work. He'd position himself at the table, usually standing, and begin his performance. And it was a performance. The carver didn't just hack away. He moved deliberately, gracefully, almost dancing with the meat. Each cut was precise. Each slice was uniform. He'd separate joints without splintering bones. He'd remove slices of breast meat so thin you could almost see through them. He'd arrange everything on serving platters with artistic flair. All while you watched, hungry, unable to touch anything. The carver served according to rank. The king or host received the best cuts first, the breast, the tenderest portions, then the queen, then the highest-ranking nobles. Your position at the table determined what meat you received and when. If you were below the salt, you'd be waiting a while, watching the good cuts disappear while the carver slowly worked his way down the hierarchy, and you had to wait patiently. You couldn't reach for meat that hadn't been offered to you. You couldn't ask the carver to hurry up. You certainly couldn't grab your own knife and start helping. That would be an unforgivable breach of protocol. Some carvers deliberately took their time, drawing out the process to showcase their skills. They'd hold a slice of meat aloft, letting everyone admire the precision of the cut before placing it on a plate. They'd arrange bones artistically on the serving platter. They'd narrate their work, explaining what they were doing as if conducting a cooking demonstration. Here we separate the wing from the breast, taking care not to tear the skin. Observe the cleanness of the joint separation. Now we slice the breast meat against the grain, ensuring tenderness. Meanwhile, you're sitting there thinking, I understand anatomy. I know what a chicken looks like. Can I please just eat? But you couldn't rush art. And carving was art. Now let's talk about what happened if you tried to carve your own meat. Let's say you forgot the rule, or you were new to court, or you were just so hungry you acted on instinct. You reached for your knife, positioned it over your slice of roast beef, and prepared to cut. Immediate reaction. The carver would freeze. Other guests would turn to look. Someone might cough pointedly. A servant might gently remove the knife from your hand. You just announced to everyone at the table that you didn't understand basic etiquette. In some courts, attempting to carve your own meat was seen as an insult to the carver. You were suggesting his skills weren't needed, that you could do his job, that his years of training were worthless. Carvers had pride. Some were genuinely offended. In other courts, it was simply seen as low-class behaviour. Self-carving was what peasants did at home, hunched over their wooden bowls, sawing away at tough meat with dull knives. You were nobility. You had people for this. Even if you had a legitimate reason, maybe the meat wasn't cut small enough, maybe you wanted a different portion. You didn't fix it yourself. You made a subtle gesture to a servant, who would summon the carver, who would return to make adjustments. The system had a process, and you followed it. But carving etiquette extended beyond just the act itself. There were rules about how to request meat, how to receive it, and how to eat it once it arrived. When the carver offered you a slice, you didn't grab it with your hands. You waited for it to be placed on your plate or trencher. You nodded politely in thanks, though not too enthusiastically, because remember, you're not supposed to show too much emotion about food. If you were offered a choice of cuts, you were expected to know which was appropriate for your rank. The best cuts were for the highest-ranking people. If you were a minor noble and you asked for the breast meat, you'd be gently redirected to something less premium. Know your place, know your meat. And once you had your meat, you still couldn't just attack it with your knife. You ate it in small, careful pieces, using your utensils properly, never biting directly from a larger slice. Even though someone else had carved it, you still had to demonstrate refinement while consuming it. Let's talk about the training carvers underwent, because it was extensive and bizarre. Young men, always men, this wasn't a profession open to women, would apprentice under master carvers for years. They'd start by learning the terminology, memorizing the names of cuts and techniques. Then they'd practice on cold roasts in the kitchen, cutting and recutting the same birds until they could do it blindfolded. They'd study animal anatomy, learning where joints were, how bones connected, where the best meat was located. They'd practice their stance, their movements, their presentation. Carving was physical theatre. You had to look good while doing it. Confident but not arrogant, skilled but not showy, efficient but not rushed. Senior carvers would critique their students mercilessly. Your angle is wrong. You're applying too much pressure. That slice is uneven. Start over. It was like culinary boot camp, except the drill sergeants were obsessed with poultry. And when a carver finally graduated from training and earned his position, he was expected to maintain those standards for his entire career. One sloppy carving session could damage his reputation. One poorly cut roast could get him demoted. There was competition among carvers. At large banquets with multiple tables, different carvers would be assigned to different stations. They'd quietly compete to see who could produce the most impressive display, who could carve the most elegantly, whose platter looked the most artistic. Guests would sometimes comment on the carving, comparing the skill of different carvers like modern diners might compare chefs. Did you see how cleanly he separated that joint? Remarkable. The slices at the high table were far more uniform than ours. Their carver is clearly superior. This created pressure. Carvers knew they were being watched, judged, compared. Every cut mattered. Every presentation was a performance review. And the knives. Oh, the knives were sacred. A carver's knives were his most prized possessions. They were custom-made, perfectly balanced, sharpened to a razor edge. Some carvers had their knives engraved with their names or family crests. Touching a carver's knives without permission was a serious offence. These weren't kitchen tools to be borrowed. They were professional instruments, treated with the reverence a musician might show their instrument. Carvers maintained their knives obsessively. They'd sharpen them before every banquet, test the edges, make sure everything was perfect. A dull knife was unacceptable. It would tear meat instead of slicing cleanly, ruin the presentation, and humiliate the carver. There are stories of carvers who were so attached to their knives that they'd sleep with them nearby, worried about theft. And theft did happen. A master carver's blade was valuable, both monetarily and symbolically. Stealing one was like stealing an artist's favourite brush. Now imagine you're a guest who's used to carving your own meat at home. You're comfortable with a knife. You know what you're doing. But at this royal banquet, you have to sit there, helpless, watching someone else portion your food like you're a child who can't be trusted with sharp objects. It's infantilizing, it's frustrating, but it's also the system. And the system exists to remind you that you're not in control. Even something as basic as cutting your own dinner is a privilege you don't have here. The carver controls the meat. The carver controls the portions. The carver controls the pace. You just sit there and receive whatever he decides to give you. It's a power dynamic disguised as service. And when the meal finally ends, after hours of watching someone else cut your food, you leave the table having learned an important lesson about royal dining. Nothing here is about practicality. It's all about hierarchy, spectacle, and reminding everyone exactly where they stand. So there you sit, watching the carver lift a perfectly sliced piece of duck breast. Place it delicately on your plate and move on to the next guest. Your knife sits unused beside your plate. Your hands are folded in your lap, and you think, not for the first time tonight, that being royalty looks glamorous from the outside but feels an awful lot like being held hostage by poultry and protocol. But at least the meat is properly carved. That's something, right? What happened to all the uneaten food after a royal banquet? It wasn't saved. It wasn't refrigerated for tomorrow's lunch. Instead, it followed a strict hierarchy of redistribution. First, the scraps went to the royal dogs. Then, if there was anything left, and that's a big if, it might be given to the poor waiting outside the castle gates. You're at the end of the banquet. The tables are covered with half-eaten roasts, picked over platters, partially consumed pies, and the skeletal remains of birds that were more decoration than dinner. There's still a shocking amount of food left, enough to feed dozens of people, maybe hundreds. But you can't take it home. There's no to-go box. No, can I get this wrapped up? No Tupperware waiting in the kitchen. Royal food doesn't leave with guests, ever. That would suggest the host hadn't fed you properly, or worse, that you were so poor you needed to hoard leftovers like a squirrel preparing for winter. So what happens to all this food? It enters the leftovers hierarchy, a carefully structured system that determined who got what, in what order, and how much would actually survive the distribution process. First in line, the dogs. And not just any dogs, the royal hunting dogs, the prized hounds, the king's favourites. These animals ate better than most people in the kingdom. They had their own handlers, their own sleeping quarters, and apparently first dibs on the leftover roast. Servants would collect the bones, the gristle, the fatty scraps, and the bits of meat that hadn't been fully consumed. All of this went into large bowls and was brought to the kennels. The dogs would feast on venison, duck, swan, peacock, the same expensive meats that had been served to nobles hours earlier. This wasn't just about feeding the dogs, it was about priorities. Those dogs were valuable. They were hunting tools, status symbols, and in some cases genuinely beloved companions. Keeping them healthy and well fed was important. More important, apparently, than feeding the poor. At least immediately. But the dogs didn't get everything. They got the scraps, the parts that couldn't be repurposed or redistributed. Bones, skin, gristle, the bits stuck to serving platters. The actual meat, if any remained, moved to the next stage. Second in line, the household servants. Not the high-ranking ones. They'd already eaten earlier, probably food from the same kitchen but prepared separately. No, this was for the lower servants. The scullery maids, the stable boys, the workers who kept the household running but were too low status to eat with anyone important. They'd gather in the kitchens or servants' hall, and whatever meat remained after the dogs had been fed would be distributed among them. This wasn't guaranteed. Some banquets were so thoroughly consumed that by the time the dogs finished, there wasn't much left. Other times there'd be substantial amounts, entire roasts that had been displayed but barely touched because guests were too full by the time they were served. The servants knew this game. They'd hover near the kitchens during banquets, hoping for a good haul. A well-attended banquet with wasteful nobles meant leftovers. A smaller gathering with efficient eaters meant going to bed hungry. And there was hierarchy even among the servants. Senior staff got first pick. Junior staff got whatever remained after that. The newest, lowest-ranking servants got the scraps of the scraps, if anything. Third in line, the poor. After the dogs had eaten, after the servants had taken their share, whatever remained, and this was often surprisingly little, would be collected and brought to the castle or manor gates, where poor people from the surrounding area would be waiting. This wasn't casual, this was expected. Poor families knew which households gave away food and when. They'd show up after major banquets, sometimes waiting for hours, hoping for whatever the wealthy had decided they didn't need. What they received was random. Sometimes it was bread trenchers soaked in gravy, not appetizing to nobles who'd eaten fresh food all night, but a treasure to someone who hadn't eaten all day. Sometimes it was chunks of meat, cold but still good. Sometimes it was just bones with a bit of meat clinging to them. Other times, it was nothing. The servants had been too hungry. The dogs had been too enthusiastic. The banquet had been smaller than expected. The poor would leave empty-handed, having wasted hours waiting for food that never materialized. And there was no guarantee of quality. The food the poor received had been sitting out for hours, sometimes in warm rooms, handled by multiple people, picked over by nobles and dogs. It wasn't fresh. It wasn't safe by modern standards. But it was food, and for people on the edge of starvation that was enough. Some households were more generous than others. Monasteries and convents, for example, had religious obligations to feed the poor. They'd save substantial portions specifically for distribution. The monks might eat simply themselves, but they'd ensure that leftover bread, soup and whatever else could be spared made it to the needy. Secular noble households were more variable. Some lords saw feeding the poor as a duty, part of their role as landowners and community leaders. They'd instruct their stewards to set aside food specifically for distribution, ensuring the poor received something of value. Other lords saw it as optional charity, something done when convenient but not prioritized. The poor might get leftovers, but only if it didn't inconvenience anyone, and only if there happened to be anything left after everyone else had taken their share. And some lords didn't bother at all. In these households, any leftover food was simply discarded, thrown out, wasted. Because the symbolism of abundance mattered more than the practical reality of hunger. Better to toss food than to appear less than lavishly wealthy. This created a perverse situation where elaborate banquets, designed to showcase wealth, generated enormous amounts of waste while people starved within sight of the castle walls. Let's talk about the logistics of the leftover process, because it was more complicated than just give food away. First, someone had to decide what was salvageable. Servants would survey the tables, identifying which foods could be safely redistributed and which needed to be discarded. Anything that looked suspicious, overly warm, discoloured or contaminated, was thrown out, regardless of quantity. Then the food had to be collected. Servants would scrape plates, empty platters, and gather everything into baskets or bowls. This took time and labour. In a large household after a major banquet, the collection process could take an hour or more. The food would then be sorted. Meat here, bread there, scraps for the dogs in a separate pile. Everything had its place, its destination, its purpose. Distribution to the dogs was straightforward. Dump it in bowls, bring it to the kennels, done. But distribution to servants required more care. Senior staff got better portions. You couldn't just throw everything in a pile and let people fight over it. There was order, even in leftover redistribution. Distribution to the poor was the trickiest. How many people were waiting? How much food was available? How do you divide it fairly? Some households had systems. Each family received a standard portion. First come, first served until the food ran out. Others were more chaotic, with servants just handing out whatever to whoever was closest. And there was always tension. The poor who received food were grateful but also resentful. They were eating scraps from the tables of people who had so much they could afford to waste it. They were dependent on charity from the same class that kept them poor through taxes, rents and labour obligations. Some refused to take the leftovers out of pride. Others took them gladly. Pragmatism, overriding dignity. And a few were so desperate they'd fight over scraps, pushing and shoving for a better portion, degrading themselves for food that had been deemed unworthy of noble stomachs. The servants managing the distribution had to maintain order, prevent fights, and ensure the process didn't become a riot. It was crowd control disguised as charity. Now let's talk about what didn't get distributed, the truly valuable leftovers. If a banquet featured particularly expensive items, certain spices, exotic fruits, rare wines, those didn't make it to the dogs or the poor. They disappeared into the household stores, saved for future use or consumed by senior staff. A half-finished bottle of imported wine didn't go to the poor. It went to the butler's private stock. Expensive saffron-spiced rice didn't become dog food. It was scraped into a container and repurposed in tomorrow's staff meal. The leftovers hierarchy wasn't just about generosity. It was about extracting maximum value from every resource. Nothing truly valuable was wasted on those who couldn't appreciate, or more accurately, couldn't pay for it. And here's the cruelest irony. The poor were expected to be grateful. They were receiving garbage, essentially, food that had been rejected by everyone above them in the social hierarchy, deemed unworthy of preservation, literally scraped off plates, and they were supposed to thank the Lord for his generosity. And many did. Because what choice did they have? In a feudal system where your survival depended on the whims of landowners, you expressed gratitude even when you were being handed scraps. You bowed, you thanked them, you praised their kindness. Because if you didn't, next time there might be nothing at all. There are accounts of lords who used leftover distribution as a tool of control. If a village was obedient, if the peasants paid their rents on time and caused no trouble, they'd receive generous leftovers after banquets. If there was dissent, complaints, or resistance, the gates would close and the food would be discarded instead. Leftovers became leverage, charity became manipulation, and the poor learned quickly that even garbage could be weaponized. By the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, some cities tried to regulate leftover distribution. They'd establish rules about how much food must be given to the poor, how often, and under what conditions. But enforcement was nearly impossible. What happened behind castle walls was the Lord's business. So there you are at the end of the banquet, leaving the hall. As you walk toward the exit, you pass the kitchens. Through the doorway, you see servants scraping plates, sorting food, filling bowls. You hear dogs barking in excitement, already smelling their dinner. And outside, through a window, you see shadows by the gates. People waiting, hoping, knowing they're third in line after dogs and servants, but waiting anyway because hunger doesn't care about pride. You keep walking. Because this is how it works. This is the system. And questioning it won't change anything. The food is already being distributed. The hierarchy is already in motion. And tomorrow, there will be another banquet. And the day after, another. An endless cycle of excess and waste and carefully managed scraps, where even the leftovers follow rules, and even charity requires you to know your place. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, European royalty were absolutely obsessed with spices. And not just because they made food taste better, though in an era of questionable meat preservation that helped. Spices were status symbols. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, they cost a fortune, and dumping them all over your food was basically the equivalent of wearing a Rolex made of diamonds. You're at the banquet table, a roasted chicken is placed in front of you. It's covered, and I mean absolutely buried, in what looks like a sandstorm of brown powder. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, all dumped on with the subtlety of someone emptying a spice rack into a single dish. The chicken is barely visible under the coating. You take a bite. Your mouth explodes with conflicting flavors. Sweet, spicy, warm, overwhelming. The actual taste of chicken is completely lost under the assault of expensive imported seasonings. It's less a meal and more a demonstration of wealth that happens to be technically edible. This was normal. This was refined. This was how rich people ate. Because in medieval and Renaissance Europe, if your food didn't taste like it had been transported across 3 continents and cost more than a horse, you were eating like a peasant. And nobody wanted to eat like a peasant. The spice trade was one of the most lucrative businesses in the world. Merchants travelled thousands of miles, crossing deserts, oceans, and hostile territories to bring peppercorns from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, and saffron from Persia. These spices were rare, exotic, and expensive enough that they were sometimes used as currency. A pound of saffron could cost more than a cow. A pound of pepper was worth more than a labourer's annual wages, and nobles used these spices not sparingly, not carefully, but lavishly, dumping them onto food in quantities that would make modern chefs weep. Why? Because the point wasn't flavour. The point was display. When you served a dish coated in cinnamon, you were saying, "I'm so wealthy that I can afford to use a spice that costs more than your house just to make my chicken taste weird." It was edible flexing, and everyone did it. Let's break down the major spices and why they were so valued, because each one came with its own level of prestige and ridiculousness. Pepper was the foundation. Black pepper, specifically. It came from India, travelled through multiple middlemen, and arrived in Europe at astronomical prices. In the Middle Ages, pepper was sometimes called black gold. It was used to pay rent, taxes, and dowries. Some towns kept pepper in their treasuries alongside actual gold. At banquets, pepper was everywhere. Peppercorns were ground fresh over dishes, mixed into sauces, baked into pastries. If your food wasn't peppery, it wasn't expensive enough. Some dishes were so heavily peppered they were nearly inedible, but that was fine. You weren't supposed to enjoy it. You were supposed to be impressed by it. Cinnamon was even more prestigious. It came from Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and was surrounded by exotic myths. Medieval Europeans didn't know where cinnamon actually came from. Spice traders kept that information secret to maintain their monopoly. So people believed wild stories. Cinnamon grew in valleys guarded by giant eagles, or it was harvested from the nests of phoenix birds. These myths made it even more desirable. Nobles used cinnamon on everything: meat, fish, vegetables, desserts. It didn't matter if it made sense. What mattered was that everyone could see you were using cinnamon, which meant you were rich enough to afford mythical bird-harvested tree bark from the edge of the known world. Cloves were similarly exotic and expensive. They came from tiny islands in Indonesia that Europeans couldn't even locate on a map. For centuries, only a handful of traders knew the actual source, and they weren't telling. Cloves were used in cooking, yes, but also in medicines and perfumes. They were believed to have magical properties. Eating cloves supposedly cured everything from bad breath to plague. Did it work? No, but wealthy people ate them anyway, studding their roasts with whole cloves until the meat looked like a medieval version of a decorative pincushion. Nutmeg and mace, which come from the same plant, were prized for their supposed hallucinogenic properties. In large quantities, nutmeg can cause mild psychoactive effects: dizziness, euphoria, nausea. Medieval nobles didn't know the chemistry, but they knew that nutmeg made them feel weird, and weird meant exotic and powerful. So they used it liberally, grated over meats, mixed into wines, baked into pies. Some people consumed so much nutmeg they probably spent entire banquets mildly high, which might explain why they thought covering chicken in cinnamon was a good idea. And then there was saffron, the most expensive spice in history. Saffron comes from the stigmas of crocus flowers. Each flower produces only 3 tiny threads of saffron. It takes thousands of flowers and hours of labour to produce even a small amount. The result? Saffron cost more per ounce than gold, and nobles used it to colour their food yellow. That's it, yellow, because apparently natural food colours weren't fancy enough. Your rice had to be golden, your sauces had to glow, your pastries had to look like they'd been blessed by the sun itself. Some banquets featured dishes where saffron was the main ingredient, not for flavour, but purely for colour and cost. You'd serve a bright yellow soup that tasted fine but cost a fortune, and your guests would nod appreciatively because they understood the message. I have so much money I can afford to make soup that costs more than your estate. But here's where the spice obsession gets truly absurd. Nobles didn't just use spices in food, they used them in everything. Spiced wines were the norm. Hippocras, a sweet-spiced wine, was served at every banquet. It was made by steeping cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and sometimes pepper in wine, then straining it and adding honey. It tasted like Christmas threw up in a goblet, but it was expensive Christmas vomit, so everyone pretended to love it. Spices were also added to medical remedies, perfumes, and even bath water. Wealthy people bathed in spiced water, believing it would cure ailments and make them smell better. They'd steep sachets of cinnamon and cloves in their baths, essentially marinating themselves like a holiday roast. And they carried spices with them. Pomanders, small decorative balls filled with spices, were fashionable accessories. You'd wear one on a chain around your neck, breathing in the scent of cloves and nutmeg to mask the smell of, well, everything else. Streets smelled like sewage. People smelled like sweat and worse. But you smelled like an expensive spice merchant's shop. Victory. Now let's talk about the dishes themselves, because medieval spiced food was wild. There was no subtlety, no hint of cinnamon or touch of nutmeg. It was all or nothing, flavour chaos designed to assault your palate and empty your treasury. One popular dish, blancmange, which despite the name wasn't the custard dessert we know today. Medieval blancmange was a chicken dish made with rice, almond milk and enough sugar and spices to turn it into something that tasted like sweetened spiced paste. It was white, hence the name, expensive, and deeply confusing to eat. Another, pottage of pork with ginger, cinnamon, cloves and pepper, all mixed into a stew that tasted like someone had confused the spice cabinet with the main ingredients. And then there were the subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures flavoured with spices, coloured with saffron, and shaped into castles, animals, or mythological scenes. You'd eat them and taste pure spice sugar, which was both overwhelming and somehow still boring because there was no contrast, no balance, just sweet, spicy, expensive intensity. The obsession with spices also led to some genuinely terrible food combinations, because if spices were good, and expensive things were good, then combining all the spices with all the expensive things must be amazing, right? Wrong. You'd get dishes like peacock in ginger cinnamon clove sauce with saffron rice and peppered figs. Each component was expensive. Together they created a flavour profile that could charitably be described as aggressively incoherent. But nobody complained, because complaining would suggest you didn't appreciate the expense, which would suggest you weren't sophisticated enough to understand that this chaos of flavours was actually refined. And if you were a visiting noble from a region with less access to spices, you were expected to be impressed. Hosts would watch you carefully, gauging your reaction to their overspiced creations. If you didn't show awe, or at least polite appreciation, you'd be judged as unsophisticated, possibly poor, definitely not worth impressing in the future. Some guests faked enthusiasm. They'd take a bite of cinnamon-crusted swan, try not to gag and exclaim, "Remarkable! I've never tasted anything quite like it." Which was true. Nobody had, because it was objectively terrible. But the worst part? The spice obsession meant that actual good cooking was undervalued. A chef who could perfectly roast a chicken, seasoning it simply to enhance its natural flavour, was less valued than one who could bury that chicken under a mountain of imported spices. Skill didn't matter. Restraint didn't matter. What mattered was cost. And the most expensive ingredient was always spice. This created a culinary arms race. Each host tried to outspice the previous one. Banquets became competitions to see who could use the most saffron, who could deploy the most exotic combinations, who could create the most expensive tasting, if not actually tasty, meal. Food stopped being about nourishment or even enjoyment. It became pure theatre, with spices as the main actors and your taste buds as unwilling audience members held hostage by social obligation. And here's the final irony. While European nobles were bankrupting themselves to buy spices, the people in the regions where those spices came from used them much more sparingly and skillfully. Indian cooks used pepper to enhance dishes, not overwhelm them. Middle Eastern cuisine incorporated cinnamon into complex balanced recipes. But Europeans, they just dumped everything on everything and called it refinement. The spice obsession eventually declined. As trade routes expanded and spices became more affordable, they lost their status symbol power. By the 18th century, using too much spice was starting to be seen as old-fashioned, even tacky. But for centuries, European nobility ate some of the worst food in history and convinced themselves it was the best, all because it was expensive. So there you sit at your royal banquet staring at a piece of lamb that's been so thoroughly coated in cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves that it looks like it's been dipped in volcanic ash. You take a bite. Your mouth is confused. Your stomach is skeptical. Your wallet, if you had one, would be weeping. But you smile. You nod. You compliment the host on their exceptional use of spices, because that's the game. And in this world, the most expensive food wins, even if it tastes like someone robbed a spice caravan and dumped the evidence on your plate. Welcome to fine dining, where flavour is optional but cost is mandatory. Thanks to the Catholic Church, eating meat on Fridays was forbidden. Fish was allowed. Simple rule, right? Except the nobility found loopholes you could sail a ship through. Barnacle geese, for example, were classified as fish because people genuinely believed they hatched from barnacles that grew on driftwood in the sea. You're at a Friday banquet. It's a fasting day, which means no meat. The Church is very clear on this. Fridays are for abstinence, for spiritual discipline, for eating simply to remember Christ's sacrifice. So naturally, the royal table is loaded with roasted goose, duck, beaver tail, and what appears to be some kind of water bird that's definitely not fish but is being served anyway. Welcome to medieval loophole theology, where the rules are made up and the definitions don't matter as long as you're rich enough to reinterpret them. The Church's reasoning was straightforward. Meat was a luxury associated with indulgence and pleasure. By abstaining from it on Fridays and during Lent and on various holy days, Christians practiced self-denial and spiritual focus. Fish was allowed because it was considered simpler, plainer, less luxurious. Except the Church didn't anticipate how creative wealthy people would get with the definition of fish. Let's start with the barnacle goose situation, because it's genuinely insane. In medieval Europe, nobody knew where barnacle geese came from. These birds would disappear in winter and return in spring, and nobody could find their nests. So people made up an explanation. Barnacle geese weren't born from eggs, like normal birds. They grew from barnacles attached to driftwood in the ocean. There were eyewitness accounts of this. Travellers claimed to have seen wooden planks covered in barnacles that, when opened, contained tiny geese. Scholars wrote about it. Artists illustrated it. And the Church, incredibly, accepted it. The logic: if barnacle geese came from the sea, from barnacles, then they were basically sea creatures. And sea creatures were fish. Therefore barnacle geese were fish. Therefore you could eat them on Fridays without violating the fast. This wasn't a fringe belief. This was official doctrine in many regions. Clergy approved it. Monasteries served barnacle goose on Fridays. Nobles feasted on roasted goose while technically observing their religious fast. It was theological gymnastics at its finest, and it worked for centuries until people actually figured out where barnacle geese nested. Spoiler: in the Arctic, like normal birds. But barnacle geese were just the beginning. Once you established that definitions were flexible, the floodgates opened. Beavers were classified as fish. Yes, beavers. The reasoning? They spend a lot of time in water. They have scaly tails. If you squint and ignore literally everything else about them, they're sort of aquatic. Close enough. The Church officially ruled that beaver was acceptable Friday food. So nobles would feast on beaver tail, which according to those who've tried it tastes like fatty fishy beef, and claim they were following the rules. Puffins were classified as fish. These are birds. They fly, they have feathers, but they also swim and eat fish, so by medieval logic, they were basically fish themselves. Monks in coastal regions ate puffin regularly during Lent, roasted or stewed, while maintaining they were observing the fast. In some regions, certain ducks and water birds received the fish classification. If it swam, if it spent time in water, if you could make even a tenuous connection to aquatic life, you could argue it was fish adjacent and therefore permissible. Capybaras in South America were later classified as fish by the Church. Giant rodents that swim. Fish, obviously. This decision came much later, during colonization, but it shows the pattern continued well into the modern era. The mental gymnastics required to believe that a beaver is a fish, while maintaining theological seriousness, is staggering, but people managed it. Because the alternative was eating actual fish, and actual fish was boring. Now let's talk about what the Church actually intended people to eat on Fridays. Real fish. Cod, herring, salmon, pike. Simple preparations. Boiled or lightly grilled. No heavy sauces. No elaborate spices. The point was austerity. Peasants followed this rule. They ate salted herring, dried cod, whatever fish they could catch or afford. It was bland, it was repetitive, but it was what the fast required. They accepted it because they had no choice and no resources to argue otherwise. But nobles turned fish day into another opportunity for extravagance. They'd serve elaborate fish courses with expensive preparations, imported species and presentations so theatrical, they made regular banquets look restrained. Sturgeon was a favourite. It was expensive, impressive, and definitely fish. Nobles would serve whole roasted sturgeon, sometimes gilded, redressed to look alive, presented on massive platters with fanfare. Lamprey eels were considered a delicacy. These horrifying parasitic fish were expensive and rare. Henry I of England allegedly died from eating too many lampreys, but that didn't stop people from serving them at Friday feasts. Oysters, lobsters, crabs, all acceptable, all expensive. And all served in quantities that made the fasting concept laughable. You weren't fasting. You were eating seafood that cost more than most people's annual income. Some nobles served fish jellies, aspic made from fish stock moulded into elaborate shapes, sometimes containing whole fish suspended in the gelatin. It looked impressive. It was definitely fish, and it was completely contrary to the spirit of abstinence. The church noticed this, obviously. Clergy would occasionally complain that wealthy people were subverting the fast, turning it into just another excuse for gluttony. But enforcement was difficult. How do you tell a powerful duke that his Friday feast is too extravagant? Especially when he's technically following the letter of the law. Some bishops tried to tighten the rules. They'd issue proclamations. Only simple fish preparations are allowed. No elaborate sauces, no gilding, no theatrical presentations. These were promptly ignored, because nobles followed rules that suited them and conveniently forgot the rest. And then there were the truly absurd loopholes. Some people argued that meat drippings were acceptable on Fridays because they weren't meat itself, just the liquid byproduct. So they'd cook vegetables in meat fat, pour meat gravies over fish, and claim they were fasting. Others separated different parts of animals. The meat of a chicken was forbidden, but what about the organs? Some argued that liver, kidneys, and other offal weren't technically meat in the spiritual sense. This interpretation didn't catch on widely, but people tried. There was also debate about meat-based stocks and broths. If you boiled bones to make soup, was that soup meat? Or was it just flavoured water? Some monasteries and noble households argued for the latter, serving vegetable soups that were essentially meat broth, with a few token vegetables floating in them. The Lenten pretzel was invented as a loophole food made from flour, water and salt. It contained no forbidden ingredients. But nobles weren't satisfied with pretzels. They wanted their usual extravagance, just technically compliant. Some wealthy Catholics hired theological consultants, priests or scholars who would research and argue for specific food classifications. Is this bird a fish? Let me consult the texts. Well, it does swim occasionally, and it eats aquatic plants. I believe a case could be made. It was like having a lawyer, but for food loopholes. And these consultants were paid well for their creative interpretations. The regional variation in rules made it even more confusing. What counted as acceptable Friday food in France might be forbidden in England. What Italian clergy approved, German bishops might condemn. Travelling nobles had to navigate a patchwork of contradictory rules. Some just gave up and ate what they wanted, then paid for indulgences. The church, always entrepreneurial, allowed people to buy forgiveness for breaking fast days. You could eat your roast beef on Friday, donate to the church, and call it square. Spiritual discipline, monetized. But most nobles didn't need indulgences. They'd just find their loophole, classify their meat as fish through increasingly absurd logic, and feast while technically observing the law. The peasants, meanwhile, watched all this happen. They ate their salted herring. They followed the rules as written. They didn't have access to barnacle geese or beaver tails or theological consultants who could reclassify poultry. And they noticed the hypocrisy. The church preached abstinence and self-denial. The rich practiced creative redefinition and aquatic meat. It was one more example of how the rules applied differently depending on your wealth and status. Some clergy tried to push back. There are sermons from medieval priests complaining about nobles who mock the fast with their excesses and pervert the meaning of abstinence with their trickery. But these sermons were preached to peasants who were already following the rules, not to nobles who were ignoring them. The Friday fish rule persisted for centuries. Even after the Reformation, when some Protestant regions abandoned it entirely, Catholic countries maintained the tradition, and the creative redefinitions continued. It wasn't until the 20th century that the Catholic Church relaxed many fasting rules. Vatican II in the 1960s made Friday abstinence optional outside of Lent in many regions. By then, the barnacle goose myth had been thoroughly debunked, Beavers were definitively classified as mammals, and most people had access to actual fish year-round. But for centuries, Friday dining was a masterclass in how the wealthy could follow the letter of religious law while completely ignoring its spirit. So there you sit, at your Friday banquet, watching servants bring out a roasted barnacle goose. It's golden brown, stuffed with herbs, and definitely a bird. But the priest at the table has blessed it as fish. So you're technically fasting. You take a bite. It tastes like fowl, because it is foul. But the fiction is maintained. Everyone nods solemnly, pretending this makes sense, pretending they're practicing spiritual discipline while eating better than most people eat on feast days. The church wanted Fridays to be about sacrifice and simplicity. Instead, for the wealthy, it became another opportunity to demonstrate that rules were for other people, and if you could afford a good enough theological argument, anything could be fish, even a beaver, even a goose, even apparently your sense of shame. So how was your day at the royal banquet? You've survived the taster's gamble with poison, waited an eternity for the king to take his first bite, navigated the napkin hierarchy, and resisted the primal urge to touch your food with your hands. You've watched birds explode from pies, suppressed every sneeze and burp your body tried to produce, and learned that swans belong to the crown, and eating one is technically treason. You've sat below the salt, knowing exactly where you rank. You've watched professional carvers slice your meat while you sat there helpless. You've endured toast after toast after toast, desperately thirsty, goblet raised until your arm went numb. You've eaten food so heavily spiced it tasted like a spice merchant's warehouse exploded, and you've watched nobles eat fish that was clearly a beaver while maintaining a straight face. You've done all of this while showing absolutely no emotion, no pleasure, no humanity, because enjoying your food too much would mark you as vulgar and uncivilized. And through it all, you've realized something important. Royal dining was never about eating. It was about performing. Every rule, every restriction, every absurd ritual was designed to remind you of your place, to test your composure, and to separate the refined from the common. The food rules weren't about nutrition or even taste. They were about control, status, and proving you understood the invisible codes that governed every aspect of aristocratic life. But here's what's remarkable. People endured this. For centuries they sat through these elaborate performances, followed these ridiculous rules, and maintained the fiction that all of it made perfect sense. They turned eating, one of the most basic human activities, into a complex social gauntlet that required years of training to navigate successfully. And yet, behind all the ceremony and absurdity, there was something deeply human happening too. People gathered. They shared meals, even if they couldn't enjoy them properly. They created traditions, even if those traditions were bonkers. They found ways to connect, compete, and communicate through food, even when the rules tried to make it impossible. The tasters who risked their lives, the carvers who perfected their craft, the servants who sorted fruit for hours, the poor who waited at the gates for scraps. They were all part of a strange, elaborate system that somehow held together, despite making no practical sense. So tonight, as you climb into your bed with its actual mattress and clean sheets, as you drink water from a tap without worrying about parasites, as you eat leftovers from your refrigerator without anyone judging you, take a moment to appreciate what you have. You can eat when you're hungry, you can drink when you're thirsty, you can use a fork without being accused of wielding Satan's utensil. You can enjoy your food, smile while eating it, even lick your fingers if you want to, and nobody will exile you for it. You don't have to wait for toasts. You don't have to sit below the salt. Your napkin is just a napkin, not a symbol of your social worth. And if you want garlic on your pasta, you can have garlic on your pasta without being accused of smelling like a peasant. The food rules that once governed royal courts seem absurd now, and they were absurd then too. But they tell us something important about human nature. We're really good at creating complicated systems to make ourselves feel superior, and we're even better at convincing ourselves those systems make sense. Royalty didn't eat better food than everyone else. Often they ate worse food, buried under spices and ceremony. But they ate differently, and for centuries that difference was enough. So rest easy tonight, knowing you're free from the tyranny of theatrical dining. You've survived a day in the life of royal food rules, and you never have to go back. Though if you ever find yourself at a formal dinner, and someone tries to tell you that you can't eat until the host does, or that your napkin size determines your worth, or that the beaver on your plate is technically a fish, you'll know exactly what's happening. You'll know you've stumbled into a world where food isn't food, it's performance, politics, and power. And you'll know enough to smile politely, play along, and then go home and eat a sandwich like a free person. Sweet dreams. And may your meals be simple, your napkins be adequate, and your swans be left in peace where they belong. On the pond, not on your plate.